"I could never trust you again," she concluded. "There is no going back. I truly do not feel I can work with you again. If you are wise for the good of the film, you will recast and pay me off. It will be cheaper in the long run." Responding with flowers and an apology, Aldrich quickly induced Davis to stay, but again he was forced to make some adjustments in her contract. Early in May, he confirmed in writing that the billing of the film would show her name on the same line as Crawford. "Both the same size, yours on the right, Joan's on the left, with an asterisk to show in alphabetical order," the producer promised, and to validate her worth as a consultant and an unofficial partner, he would give her an additional 15% of 100% of net profits, the same cut as Joan, with 20th Century Fox assuming 10% of that payment. On May 14th, with a firm start date agreed upon, Fox held an open party to reintroduce the stars and the director to the press. Bette arrived on time with Bob Aldrich. Joan arrived precisely 15 minutes late. "This isn't going to be Baby Jane Strikes Back. It's altogether a different picture," Aldrich told the assembled reporters. "Yes," said Bette, "it's a whole new story. Miss Crawford and I are not doing an Andy Hardy series." "I am not in a wheelchair this time," said Joan. "I will be very active and appear more attractive, I might add. My character works in public relations in New York, which means I will get to wear some beautiful, expensive clothes. Right, Bob?" "Certainly, Joan." "And I will be singing the title song in the picture," said Bette, "accompanied by a harpsichord. It will be quite lovely." "What about the billing?" a reporter asked. "We tossed a coin and Miss Crawford won," said Aldrich. "There will be an asterisk beside Joan's name and one beside Betty's," a publicist hastily spoke up. "The asterisk reads in alphabetical order." According to Motion Picture, enmity between the two stars erupted anew on day one of the costume fittings, when Joan arrived and found she was barred from the set where Bette was testing her wardrobe and makeup. "Comparative testing is important for contrast," said the magazine. "If one star is wearing her hair down, the other will probably wear it up. If one wears pink, the other certainly is not going to wear pink." When Joan complained to Aldrich, he asked his partner, Bette, to call and mollify her co-star. "What does it matter, Joan?" said Bette, attempting to ease Joan's paranoia. "I am going to be a mess, and you are going to look your usual gorgeous self." "Dear Bette," said Joan, comforted for the moment. On May 18th, the cast showed up for the first day of rehearsals, on Stage 6 at Fox. For an opening day gift, Joan gave Bette a huge box, tied in ribbon, of kitchen matches, the kind that Bette liked to strike on her shoe or rear end. Bette sent Joan a thank-you note. At the first reading, closed to the press, Bette was sitting at the round table, hunched over, with her glasses perched on her nose, when she noticed that Madame, Joan, was preening unduly. Up in the flies, in the catwalks overhead, the star had sensed there was a photographer recording the proceedings. "I asked Aldrich if I could take some shots," said Phil Stern. "He said, 'No way, you son of a bitch, I have enough trouble with the two dames.' I kept pleading. I told him my coverage of the Baby Jane rehearsals brought him good luck. He said, 'Okay, but damn it, keep out of our way and don't let the ladies see you.'" Using a long lens, Stern was up in the flies, confident that no one could spot him. Except for Joan. The woman had radar up her ass. Maybe she heard the clicking of my camera because she straightened her spine and started smiling and acting very gracious to Bette and Joseph Cotton and the rest of the cast. Then she began to inch her Pepsi bottle towards the middle of the table so it would be in the shots. Bette noticed this and leaned forward, blocking the Pepsi bottle. When Joan pushed the bottle out further still, Bette moved forward again. It was a riot. They were competing for space with the Pepsi bottle between them. During the rehearsals, it was said, Davis held up the proceedings by questioning every line. There were problems with the script, Lucas Heller recalled. Bob Aldrich had originally hired Henry Farrell to write the story and script of Charlotte. They had a disagreement over protocol. Aldrich had kept Farrell waiting, and he walked out. I was called in to rework the script. Aldrich was a great director, but the story was not his strongest point. He wanted a bit of diabolique, a bit of this, a bit of that. We didn't have the time we had on Baby Jane, which was reworked over a period of 6 months. Bette Davis made only the usual actor's comments about lines, which is the object of rehearsals, said Heller. Joan Crawford then insisted that she have her say. She would query lines with absolutely no concept of the emotional or dramatic content, but purely on the grammatical or logical element. She argued for hours, being very literal in her interpretation, and always putting it in this beautiful, modulated voice. She was giving a performance. She wanted to establish her authority on the picture, and everyone had to go along with her. Motion Picture reported that Bette slapped Joan's hands away from her while they rehearsed a scene where Cousin Miriam had to help poor mad Charlotte into bed. "I'm not going to do the scene until it's written right," said Davis, and strode off the set. "We leave for Baton Rouge, Louisiana this weekend for 10 days of location shooting," said Bob Aldrich at the end of rehearsals. "I hope we live through it." Cannibal Time in Dixie. "You're a vile, sorry little bitch. What is it you say you do? Public relations? It sounds like something pretty dirty to me." Cousin Betty to Cousin Joan in Sweet Charlotte. On Sunday, May 31st, traveling in a chartered plane, the Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte company arrived at the airport in Baton Rouge. When they posed for a group photograph for the Louisiana News, it was noticed that Joan Crawford was not with the troupe. "Why? I don't know why," said unit publicist Harry Mines. "Betty went both ways, round trip with the gang. I guess Joan wanted to travel on her own." The entire company were put up at the Belmont Motel, a mile outside the city. "The accommodations were always first class with Aldrich," said Bob Gary, on hand again as script supervisor. "No one had to double up. Everyone had their own bungalow." 3 locations were chosen for filming: an office on Government Street in Baton Rouge, a house in Oak Valley, Vacherie, where Mary Astor's character would reside, and a moss-covered antebellum mansion near Burnside, Louisiana, overlooking the Mississippi River. It was here that the next duel between the leading stars would be played out, before and behind the motion picture cameras. With Crawford not scheduled to arrive until the 4th day of filming, Bette used that time to make friends with the local and visiting press. Never overly partial to giving interviews, Bette called in all the reporters and entertained them for an hour with the best copy she'd ever given, said Hedda Hopper. Bette also became tight with the Charlotte crew. "Her trailer was parked at the front side of the mansion," said Harry Mines, "but Bette was seldom there. She set up this huge mirror in the hallway of the house, and she put on her makeup there. At lunchtime, she had her meals outside with Aldrich and the Grips." On Wednesday, June 3rd, Crawford, her maid, Mamacita, her hairdresser, Peggy Shannon, her makeup man, Monty Westmore, and her luggage arrived at the Baton Rouge airport. Expecting a VIP welcome, perhaps the mayor or a marching brass band, the star was chagrined to learn that no one, not even a member of the Charlotte production company, was there to meet her. "There was a foul-up in the schedule," said Harry Mines. "Everyone was filming at the plantation house, and somehow Joan's arrival was not relayed to the proper driver." When she reached the Belmont Motel, Joan found her rooms were not made up, and she had to sit for an hour in the motel's lobby. Then she was put in a bungalow next to the garbage disposal unit. That evening, as soon as the unit had returned from filming, Joan complained to the wrong person, Bette Davis. "Oh, Joan, pull yourself together. This is Baton Rouge, not Beverly Hills," said Bette, who was settled in the slightly larger, more luxurious bungalow across the way from Crawford. "The trouble between the two was still there," said publicist Harry Mines. "We were the wave that followed the wave. Aldrich was the referee, and all of us knew we were going to have to work around the unpleasantness." On location, the wake-up call for the entire company was 7 a.m., except for Joan Crawford, who was up an hour earlier. "It was a regular 3-hour routine," said Monty Westmore. "I'd wake her up at 6. She'd exercise a little bit while I set out her makeup. Then she'd make breakfast, which I had to eat." Under the special lights at her makeup table, while Joan sat and worked on her face, Westmore stood by her side for 2 hours and worked on her obligatory false eyelashes. They always had to be just right, trimmed perfectly in line, then curled in a circle. I would lay out 6 pair for her on the table. She would then inspect them. "This one's good, that isn't," she would say, going down the line. When I glued them on her eyelids and she was finished spitting and putting the mascara on them, they'd be uncurled and look right. We went through a gross and a half of eyelashes per picture, and later when she was traveling for Pepsi, she'd send me more to work on. I'd clean 'em and set 'em and roll 'em and curl 'em and send them back to her in Europe or wherever. She was very particular about her eyelashes, and so was Bette Davis. Neither Westmore nor Bob Schiffer, Betty's makeup man, ever touched the stars' faces. Joan did her own face and mouth, said Westmore, and they were welcome to their mouths, said Schiffer. I didn't believe in all that heavy lipstick or the thick pancake around their eyes. On Charlotte, I had my own makeup concept for Betty, which lasted about 5 minutes. She would say to me, "Don't fuck with my face." But she was a pro with a great sense of humor. Once she gave me an 8x10 photograph of herself with her face superimposed on the body of a Playboy cover girl. It was a very erotic pose. Some people thought it was really Betty. "If this gets out, it's your ass," she told me. She was very frank and was always a trooper, but inflexible about the look of her face and lips. Crawford wouldn't listen to you either. All you did was work on the eyelashes, then hold the mirror for her between setups. It was a servitude position, and Joan made the slaves look like Boy Scouts. Arriving for her first day of shooting at the Mississippi mansion, Crawford let it be known that, unlike Betty, she didn't intend to become too chummy with the film company. She had her trailer set up at the back of the house, with her own golf cart to take her back and forth when we were filming, said Harry Mines. While Crawford rides around in her golf cart, Betty walks, Hedda Hopper reported. Betty lets her hair down, but Joan surrounds herself with the aura of a great of yesterday. Times have changed, and she doesn't seem to realize that, said Sheila Graham. Betty was crazy in some areas, but she stayed a human being, Bob Gary recalled. But Joan always had the act going. She expected obeisance from everyone. When you approached her, it was almost like you had to genuflect. It was in Joan's contract that her trailer be placed so many yards away from Betty, which was understandable, said Harry Mines, but it caused difficulties for all of us. Whether by design or accident, every time a shot was set up for the two stars, there would be a sweltering delay in the sun waiting for Joan Crawford to emerge from her ice-cold trailer, said writer Gail Cameron for McCall's. There was only one scene involving Betty and Joan at the mansion, and that was deliberately delayed by Aldrich. First, we shot all of Betty's scenes with Agnes Moorehead and Cecil Kellaway, said Bob Gary. Then we did Joan's scenes with Joseph Cotton and the other actors. Bob Aldrich wanted to put off the moment when the two war horses got together. It was publicist Harry Mines who had the arduous task of bringing the two ladies together for interviews. Working with temperamental and tormented stars was not unusual for him, he claimed. A few years before, he had been the unit publicist in Nevada for The Misfits, Marilyn Monroe's last picture. He remembered. She was in bad shape, overweight and on pills. When she arrived in Nevada, she said she wasn't going to see any press. She was rude. I became angry. I told her, "Okay, we'll close the set to everyone. You can work, and I'm leaving." She acted surprised. She said no one ever spoke to me like that. I said, "Well, it's about time someone did." She looked at me a long time and said, "All right, I'll work with you." I said, "If you don't like any reporter or photographer, we'll use the old dodge of stroking your ear or something and I'll get rid of them." She said, "No, I'll go through with it." But even then it was tough getting her together with the press. You always had to go look for her. Clark Gable saved the situation many times for me. He was a wonderful human being. He would say, "Look, when you have these people out here and you have trouble finding Marilyn, just call me. I'll keep them entertained until she shows up." He was a magnificent man. Working with Crawford and Davis on Hush Hush Sweet Charlotte was double trouble, said Mines. The two stars didn't want to pose for pictures, not even for the still photographer. Then Life magazine decided to do a piece on the filming, and that made it a little easier for me because neither Betty nor Joan could say no to Life. The photographer assigned to that story was Flip Schulke. "Betty was fantastic," he said, "but Crawford was a bum. Betty joked around a lot, wearing blue jeans and carrying a big box of matches and a Coke bottle. Crawford had Pepsi machines installed around the place. She was a very cool customer. She never seemed to show consideration for anyone. She always arrived 3 or 4 minutes late for her scenes. Betty would turn to me and say, 'She's making a grand entrance just for you.' I wanted to photograph the two of them making up. Betty started from scratch in her dressing room. When I got to Joan's trailer, she was already made up, and she posed very grandly with an eyebrow pencil as though she was just beginning. Everything was posed with her. Nothing could be candid, and she would tell me when to take the picture. The idea of having the two ladies pose for photographs sitting on tombstones in a cemetery came from director Bob Aldrich. Bob appreciated the publicity value of the feud between the two stars, said Harry Mines, but he never took sides as far as I knew. He had a fake cemetery built on the plantation property, and when he suggested the two pose sitting on the tombstones, I thought, what a great shot, but who is going to ask them to do it? Aldrich wouldn't. The photographer wouldn't. I suggested it to Bette first, and she roared with laughter. She was all for it. Joan was a little reluctant at first, but it was for Life magazine, so she went along with it. When it came time to do the tombstone photographs, the session lasted for hours due to the stars' egos and conflicting schedules. There were 3 or 4 different sessions, said Mines. It was done between filming. Joan would be ready when Bette would be called away. When Bette returned, Joan would be gone, back in her trailer with her clothes off, resting. She would take a long time getting ready. Eventually, the last time, when Bette came back to do the shots and Joan was missing, she said, "I'm going to settle this once and for all because I know you guys have a job to do." She went to the back of the house to Joan's dressing room. She rapped on her door, then stood outside and yelled, "Joan Crawford, get your clothes on and come and do these photographs right away." Joan said, "Oh, Bette, I'm coming, I'm coming." She came hurtling out the door. They did the photographs, and when it was all over, the photographer, who was just as nervous as I was, said, "My God, I forgot to take some color." I said, "Oh, Jesus." He said, "We've got to get them together again." "Not on your life or mine," I told him. I wouldn't ask them even if it was for a cover. As it turned out, Life never used any of the shots. They were only interested in Bette and Joan as a team, so when Joan left the film, they killed the story and the tombstone photographs were never published. Miss Crawford always says good morning when she walks on the set. Miss Davis seldom answers her. 3 hours later, she may say hi, and Miss Crawford looks around to see if she's addressing her or someone else. Lily Mae Caldwell. According to Joan Crawford, she tried very hard to reconcile her differences with Bette Davis during those first days and nights in Baton Rouge. "It was a challenge to try and make her my friend," she told motion picture reporter Len Baxter. "Crawford obviously wants to clear the air," said Baxter, "but Davis is not able to kiss and make up. She doesn't know how to say I'm sorry, and Crawford doesn't feel she has anything to be sorry for." Forgiveness was never one of Betty's weaknesses, her friends agreed. She could not easily forget the humiliation she had suffered because of Crawford's behavior at the Oscars the previous year. Perhaps if Joan had prostrated herself in front of Bette and the entire company, and begged her forgiveness in front of the Louisiana State Assembly, then Bette would have considered a pardon, with qualifications, said a cast member. But Joan wouldn't offer a crumb of contrition, so the major games of revenge began. "Bette told me that Joan was terrified of her on the second film," said Vic Greenfield. "And with good reason. After the business with the Oscar, this was war." Vengeance in the movies was always sweet, and short of spiking Joan's Pepsi with cyanide or tampering with the brakes of her car, which had been done in Queen Bee, in real life Bette loathed the obvious. Her retaliation on Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte, had to be inconspicuous and final. "She wanted to make a basket case out of Joan, and she almost succeeded," said George Cukor. Censuring Crawford for her heavy drinking and star posturings would not be enough. This second time around, Bette intended to attack Joan's more vulnerable areas, her advancing age and appearance. Having turned 60 that April, Crawford was more sensitive than ever that her true age be kept from the press and public. She insisted on going with the lower figure of 56, the same age as Bette. But in a joint story for the Birmingham News, Davis told the reporter, Lily Mae Caldwell, that if their ages were printed, Lily Mae should note that Joan was 4 years older. "She's 60, and I have witnesses who can prove it," said Bette. In her story, Caldwell, an old friend of Joan's, omitted all mention of age. "Each is a Hollywood star of first magnitude," the reporter wrote. "But it's Joan, not Bette, who is the queen of this bayou country plantation, where the murder mystery is being filmed." When the two stars were invited to the governor's mansion for a reception, they arrived in separate cars and held court on opposite sides of the room. The wives were enchanted by Joan, by her soft-spoken voice and manners, while the men seemed more taken with the outspoken, more bawdy Betty, said Caldwell. During the evening, when another reporter approached Betty and began to speak about the lovely Joan Crawford, her co-star spoke up promptly. "Yes, she is lovely, isn't she?" said Betty. Then, in a voice loud enough to be heard across the Mississippi River, Betty added, "She is quite a dame for her age. She's over 60, you know." Betty was also publicly derisive of Joan's extensive location wardrobe. "For a goddamn week in Baton Rouge, she brought 20 pieces of luggage. It was a black and white movie, but she had color-coordinated outfits for the daytime scenes, and for the night shots all of her evening dresses were chiffon, which meant that the wardrobe lady had to spend hours ironing them in the 100-degree weather." There was also the matter of Joan's thinning hair, becoming finer with advancing age, as was Betty's. Both stars wore wigs in Baby Jane and Charlotte, said Monty Westmore. "She brought mounds of hairpieces to Louisiana," said Betty. "Maggie Donovan, who had been my hairdresser for years, said to me one day, 'We're up to our asses in Crawford's hairpieces.'" Most Aries are inclined to forgive and forget all but the most cruel encounters. If one ram is stronger and insists on butting away, the weaker ram gradually turns into a neurotic sheep. Astrologer Linda Goodman. Off the set at the Belmont Motel, Betty continued to ostracize Joan. Socially, she made sure that it was she and not Crawford who was the leading hostess of the Sweet Charlotte Film Company. Each evening, she held court in her larger bungalow across the way from her rival. She entertained Joseph Cotton, George Kennedy, Cecil Kellaway and his wife, and Bob Aldrich. One night, she hosted a get-together for Mary Astor. "That was Astor's last picture," said Harry Mines. "She was there for 3 days. She didn't want to see me. She had closed herself away from everyone. It made my job a little difficult. I mentioned that to Betty, and she said, 'Do you need to talk to Mary?' I said I'd like it if I could. She said, 'My dear, let me take care of it. I'll have Mary over tomorrow night for drinks, and you can come in and meet her.'" Drinks for Miss Astor became a party, with all of the cast on hand except Joan Crawford. "Betty didn't invite her," said Harry Mines. "Why should I?" said Betty. "Miss Crawford and I never socialized." "Joan was staying in the bungalow across the way," said Mines, "and during the party I looked out the window and saw her drive off for dinner with Mamacita." Betty also organized several social evenings in Baton Rouge, including a trip to a local nightclub to see ex-housewife-turned-comedian Phyllis Diller. Agnes Moorehead was Betty's special guest that evening, and 2 nights later she hosted a dinner for Bob Aldrich in a nearby restaurant. Again, Crawford was not invited, but left to herself in her bungalow, where the empty vodka bottles were beginning to pile up outside her door. Socially and psychologically, the star was beginning to crumble. "Betty does not play a part, she attacks it. She comes on hungry," and Joan began to worry. She too was coming on hungry, but when she entered the dining room, instead of devouring her dinner, she began to feel she was the dinner. Joseph Cotton. It was said that Betty, as a partner on the film, used her leverage to co-direct the picture. "She and Aldrich were very tight," said Harry Mines. "She was always by his elbow." Unlike Joan, when she's through with her scene, she retires to her dressing room, Betty remains on the set like a spy. "She sits in her canvas chair watching every scene," said Paul Gardner in Action magazine. "What I remember is how helpful Betty was to the other actors," said photographer Flip Schulke. "One day this old guy, Cecil Kellaway, had trouble with his lines, and Betty kept walking him back and forth outside the house, going over his lines with him." Betty was a formidable presence on the set, and I think she intimidated Joan, said Bob Gary. When asked in 1987 to respond to reports that Crawford was scared to compete with her on this second film, Betty replied, "Things were quite different from Jane. She had quite a lot of people to contend with. There was Kellaway and Mr. Joseph Cotton and Agnes Moorehead. I think it was a combination of all those people." "Joseph Cotton and Agnes Moorehead would hardly seem to be a problem for Joan Crawford," said Bill Aldrich. "Joan could have taken them with one hand. Betty was something else. She worked the company, the crew. She was a very strong lady who was still carrying on a one-way feud with Crawford. It began at rehearsals of Jane, went through that picture and through Charlotte. In Betty's mind, to this day, it has never stopped. In the last 3 days in Baton Rouge, the shots involving Bette and Joan were completed. In the first sequence, there was no dialogue involved. Joan was to arrive at the plantation mansion in a cab, then exit carrying a small case, pay the driver, and lowering her sunglasses, look up at the balcony of the house where Bette, in pigtails and a nightgown, was standing in the shadows, holding a shotgun. The scene was designed to be photographed in a wide, continuous shot, and thanks to Crawford's proficient technical skill, it was completed in one take. Later that evening, when Harry Mines called on Bette in her motel bungalow, he found her standing in the middle of the room practicing Joan's scene. "My God," said Bette. "I've been here all evening long with a pair of dark glasses and some luggage, and I'm imagining getting out of a cab and trying to do that whole business in one gesture. How did she do it?" That praise was apparently never conveyed to Crawford, nor was Bette regressive in her criticism of her co-star. On the next day, during the filming of a Crawford scene on the veranda, according to Motion Picture, Bette positioned herself in front of the camera. "This is strictly unusual," said Len Baxter. "A director doesn't permit an actor to sit in front of the camera, directly in another actor's line of vision, unless the actor is part of the scene." During one of Joan's close-ups, Bette turned to Director Aldrich and said in a loud voice, "You're not going to let her do it like that, are you?" Trembling, but a pro, Crawford finished the scene and returned to her dressing room. Late that night, concerned about her work, the actress said, she called Aldrich in his motel room. It was past midnight, and Crawford apologized for waking him up. "I was worried," said Joan. "I wanted to explain how I felt about those scenes. I urged that they be redone. He said I was overreacting, that my work was fine. But then I heard this second voice talking loudly beside him. I knew immediately who it was. It was Miss Davis. She was there, in Mr. Aldrich's bed." "I wouldn't put it past Mother to let Joan Crawford believe that she was having an affair with Bob Aldrich," said Beatty Hyman. "But I don't think there was ever a physical relationship between them. Certainly Mother was always adoring of her directors when they got along and hated them when they didn't. She would always concoct these fantasies that this director or that was madly in love with her. But I think the last thing in this universe that Bob Aldrich would even consider was a relationship with either Mother or Crawford, and certainly not with Mother." On June 12th, the last day of shooting in Louisiana, further ignominy was served on Joan. After some late afternoon shots, she was relaxing in her trailer, on hand if needed for additional scenes. She apparently dozed off because when she woke up, it was dark. When she sent Mamacita to check when shooting would be completed, she found the place empty. The crew had packed up and left, leaving Joan at the rear of the house in her trailer with no transportation back to the motel. "There were a lot of mishaps on location," said Bob Gary. "We had a production manager who drank a lot. He would get drunk and forget to schedule things. When we were ready to leave Baton Rouge the next day, Aldrich found out we had no plane. The one we normally used wasn't scheduled. It was off someplace else. They brought us back to Los Angeles on this old beat-up World War II plane. We were almost killed in transit," said Peggy Shannon. "It had trouble taking off," said Gary. "When we got back to L.A., we found a lot of shrubbery and branches stuck to the wheels of the plane. These were the tops of trees we cut off when clearing the runway. Everyone laughed, but if we had gone down, the headline would have read, 'Bette Davis killed in crash. No survivors reported.'" Except for Joan Crawford, who flew back to Los Angeles first class on a commercial airline that evening. The privacy and distance from the company gave her time to pacify her rage and come up with a solution to combat the winning Bette. "The fight was much fiercer the second time around, and Joan did not enjoy losing," said Monty Westmore. "She was facing the same situation as with Baby Jane," said Bob Aldrich. "When she accepted the film, she knew her part was subordinate to Betty's. When shooting started, she realized she was playing second banana again, and she wanted no part of that." There were few options for the losing star. In Baton Rouge, Crawford had called her agent, who spoke to Bob Aldrich about fattening up her part. The answer was no. The script was set, along with the shooting schedule, Aldrich replied. There could be no rewrites for either actress at this late date. Crawford then called Leonard Rosen, her lawyer in New York. She wanted him to find a legal out in her contract. There was none, he told her. If she quit the picture, she could be sued for breach of contract. Her only recourse was to bow to Bette and finish the picture. But this was Joan Crawford, conqueror of men and idol of millions. She could not, would not allow herself to be vanquished by anyone, especially Bette Davis. As long as she had the spirit to fight and the ability to scheme, she knew the battle was not yet over. By the time she arrived at Los Angeles International Airport that Saturday evening, Crawford had her defense strategy in order. Leaving the airport in her limousine, the star tapped on the dividing window and instructed her driver that there was a change in directions. She did not want him to go to her apartment on Fountain Avenue. They were to proceed directly to Cedars-Sinai Hospital, where she intended to check herself in as a patient. As happens in times of stress, Crawford became ill, Bob Thomas reported. I can't tell you what I went through during those weeks that shooting stopped, waiting for Crawford to get well. It was sheer torture. Bette Davis. The following Monday, June 15th, with Crawford in the hospital, her stand-in, E.M. Jones, substituted for the star on the first day of filming. It was just a matter of days, we were told, and Joan would be back, said Bob Gary. Bette Davis, who knew a few things about faking illnesses from her battles with Jack Warner, advised Bob Aldrich not to cater to Joan's tricks. On June 16th, 17th, 18th, and 19th, Aldrich rescheduled scenes and shot around the missing actress. That Friday, he requested a medical report from the hospital and was told that Crawford had a bad case of dysentery and an excessively high blood count. The following day, the hospital reported that the patient had developed a sore throat and intermittent cough. It is no wonder she has a cold, said Bette Davis. She insists on having the sound stages frozen at 50 degrees. Grown men were wearing lumber jackets and the ladies had long underwear under their dresses. We were freezing our asses off. At the end of the second week, when Aldrich had completed the scenes with the other actors, Joan Crawford was still in the hospital. By then, it was Davis's belief that her opponent wanted out of the picture. But Crawford's lawyer turned down a settlement offer on her behalf. This confused Aldrich and his star partner. Just what is her angle? Bette asked. A possible answer came from Hedda Hopper's column that weekend. I am bedded with the script, Joan told the columnist. It will be a much better movie when I've recovered. On day 12 of her illness, the director spoke to Crawford. She confirmed she had some wonderful new script ideas for him. For starters, she felt that the audience should know more about Miriam, her character. There was a considerable amount of background on Betty's character as a young woman, etc., and none on hers. Aldrich agreed that a flashback scene could be inserted, showing the two characters as young women. Joan also felt, inasmuch as Miriam had been and was still a very beautiful woman, it didn't seem authentic that she had only one gentleman caller, Joseph Cotton, in the entire script. She should have more beaux, said Joan. How many beaux? The director asked. At least 2. Perhaps an attorney and a politician, the star recommended. Major idea number 3 was the inclusion of a good old-fashioned Southern ball at the mansion. A formal party welcoming Cousin Miriam back to Louisiana would give a dandy, decorative, and dramatic boost to the story. It would enable Joan to dress up and make a spectacular entrance down the grand staircase. Charlotte, Bette, could be there, of course, under the staircase or watching from her bedroom, Crawford suggested. That would increase the conflict between the two and make Cousin Miriam seem like more of a threat. There will be no goddamn ball or any changes in the script, said Cousin Bette, when Aldrich went over Crawford's suggestions with her on Monday, June 29th. On Tuesday, June 30th, Joan's cold suddenly became worse and developed into pneumonia. On Thursday, Aldrich was forced to inform the cast and crew of Hush Hush, Sweet Charlotte that production was temporarily closing down. A week later, Crawford was still in the hospital. No one could figure out what was wrong with her, said Bill Aldrich. Dr. Kennemer, Elizabeth Taylor's specialist, has diagnosed Joan's mystery ailment as a rare form of pneumonia, Hedda Hopper reported. The cause of it has the specialists and the insurance companies stumped. "They thought perhaps it was hairspray that got into her lungs," said Peggy Shannon, "but I told them I never use hairspray." On July 10th, with her health improved slightly, Joan was able to sit up, take calls, and fully appreciate the attention that at last was being paid. The flowers, cards, and notes came in abundance from the Sweet Charlotte Company. "We love you," said the giant card, signed by each member of the crew. "Come back, we miss you," wrote Agnes Moorhead. "Well," said Sidney Skolsky, "what do you hear from Betty?"
"Nothing."
"No flowers?"
"No flowers."
"No telegrams?"
"No telegram."
"No card?"
"No card."
"No call?"
"No call."
"Dear Mr. Aldrich," said a letter found in the director's files, "I read about Miss Crawford's respiratory illness, and I feel positive it is psychosomatic. Joan wants a little more depth in her role, and her subconscious mind is holding out for the change. Give her what she wants, and mark my words, Mr. Aldrich, her illness will disappear. Believe me, it's worth a try. Most sincerely, Mrs. Betty Clark." On Monday, July 20th, Crawford returned to work. Arriving at Fox at 6:30 a.m., she spent 3 hours in makeup, then, accompanied by her retinue, stepped on the soundstage to applause and hugs from the cast and crew. Bette Davis also joined in the welcome. She handed Joan one perfect red rose with, surprise, the thorns removed, said Dorothy Kilgallen. Upon going through the script and counting the revised pink pages, Joan seemed content, assuming her role had been magnified. But on the afternoon of the second day, she learned that her part was going to be diminished further by Betty. Resuming her position of authority behind the camera, Davis announced, during a scene between Crawford and Joseph Cotton, that she wanted some lines eliminated. "I am cutting some dialogue," said Betty, wielding a large red pencil and excising large chunks of dialogue from Joan's scene. "Miriam doesn't need them, and you, Mr. Cotton, I hope you don't mind. These lines hold me up." This time Joan abandoned her professionalism. She turned on her heel and went to her dressing room, Len Baxter reported. "It was just a matter of each wanting something, and Davis kind of won out," said Monty Westmore. "Not quite," said the party of the second part. According to the insurance reports for the next day, a weakened Joan Crawford reported to work and left at noon. On Thursday, July 23rd, she left at 11 a.m. On Friday, she departed for home at 15 minutes past noon. Skeptical of her condition, Robert Aldrich, at the urging of Davis, decided to have Crawford followed that weekend by a private detective. His report was found in the director's files. Case number 5229. Date of report, July 27, 1964. Subject, Joan Crawford, 8313 Fountain Avenue, Apartment D. In compliance with instructions from Mr. Aldrich, a stakeout and surveillance was maintained on the above location in an effort to determine if the named subject departed the premises over July 24th, 25th, 1964. The following information is submitted as a result of observations made at the times indicated. According to the private detective, no activity of interest was reported on Joan's apartment house on Friday evening or all day Saturday, except for the spotting of Loretta Young, who also resided in the building. On Saturday at 5 p.m., a late-model Rolls-Royce, two-tone brown, was observed to depart and proceed west on Fountain Avenue. Vehicle displayed license number 071483 and was driven by a woman appearing to be the subject. She wore a bandana with her hair and dark sunglasses. There is little or no doubt that this was Miss Crawford, and she was alive at the time. Detailing the streets that Joan drove along, mostly in Beverly Hills, the sleuth confessed that at the intersection of Wilshire and Santa Monica Boulevard, he lost the subject. Circling the streets in the area and the garage and parking lot of the adjacent Beverly Hilton Hotel, he could not locate the car or Miss Crawford. Returning to her building, he checked the open parking spaces to determine if the Rolls-Royce had been returned. It hadn't. At 6:10 p.m. until 11 p.m., stakeout was resumed at the entrance to the garage area so that subject could be observed returning. At 11:30 p.m., when the car had not been observed, surveillance was discontinued. "She gave the fool the slip," Bette Davis blared with amazement and approval when Aldrich gave her the sleuth's report. On Monday, July 27th, Joan came to work but quit at 12:55 p.m., complaining of fatigue again. That afternoon, an insurance meeting was held at the studio, attended by Bob Aldrich, his lawyer, and the vice president of production at Fox, Richard Zanuck. During the meeting, the lawyer placed a call to Crawford's lawyer, Leonard Rosen, in New York. He explained to him in minute detail the seriousness of the situation, and that if Crawford was unable to daily extend her working period, the insurance company would force us into taking some drastic action. When asked for a definition of drastic action, Aldrich's lawyer replied, A. Cancel the picture, B. Replace Crawford. In either case, it would probably resolve itself in Crawford's future uninsurability for future pictures. The following day, Tuesday, July 28th, when Crawford showed up for work, Aldrich met with her in her dressing room and rephrased the warning. It was quite obvious that she and her lawyer had talked, the director wrote in a memo to Dick Zanuck. She went on to state that her point of low energy seemed to be right after lunch. I suggested we take a 2 to 2.5 hour lunch and that she come back and work after that. That was done, and the total of Tuesday's work was 5 hours and 25 minutes, which, all things considered, wasn't too bad. On the set on Wednesday, Joan worked until 1:30, then informed Aldrich she had overtaxed herself the previous day, and that reluctant as she was, she would have to return to a less strenuous shooting schedule. Aldrich, in turn, informed the star that he wanted her examined by the company's insurance doctor. Resenting his suspicions and the harassment, Joan said she was returning to her dressing room and would no longer talk directly to the director. "The only way they communicated was through me," said the star's makeup man, Monty Westmore. "Joan would tell me something, then I'd go and tell Aldrich. He would give me a reply to take back to Joan. It was an unpleasant, awkward position for me to be in." That same afternoon, Aldrich spoke to Dick Zanuck, and the two agreed to give Crawford the benefit of the doubt. They would declare a short hiatus in filming. Production would shut down for 3 more days, from Wednesday afternoon, July 29th, until Monday morning, August 3rd, to give the ailing star a chance to recover. I returned to the stage and informed Crawford in the plainest and simplest language that the situation was so serious we could not continue in this matter, said Aldrich. He also called her lawyer. An hour later, Joan emerged from her trailer and went to Aldrich's office. She asked if she could rehearse on the stage during her days off, he said. I told her I thought this would be contrary to the spirit of the hiatus, since we wanted her to get total rest. And I doubted if this would put us in very good light with the insurance company, to have her parading around the stage while we maintained she was incapable of shooting. Crawford then changed her approach. She told the director that her apartment was so hot during the daylight hours it was uninhabitable, and would we allow her to spend those hours in her Fox dressing room? I replied that anything that would speed and help her recovery would be to our collective advantage, and of course this would be okay. Meanwhile, Bette Davis began to feel she was entitled to equal angst time. On the following day, Thursday, she had been scheduled to report to Fox to record dialogue with the other cast members. That morning, she called the director and begged off. She was filled with despair and despondency, Aldrich told Dick Zanuck, and truly sad. Her point was that she was so depressed at not knowing when and if the picture was ever going to be finished, and she seriously doubted her capacity to contribute much to the pre-recording. Feeling that understanding was the best part of economics, the director excused Bette, and the recording was canceled. Perhaps you should be advised, Aldrich told Zanuck, that it is Davis's belief that after this serious warning, Crawford will return to work and give full time for 1 or 2 days and then revert to being too tired. Whether there is any validity in this, I no longer know. On Friday morning, upon the advice of her lawyer, Crawford agreed to submit to a medical examination by the insurance doctor. To validate her fragile respiratory condition, she requested that a portable X-ray machine be brought to her air-conditioned dressing room. She also insisted that Dr. Princemetal, Aldrich's lawyer, be in attendance. Her willingness to cooperate in the examination intrigued Aldrich and aroused the suspicions of Bette, who said that she wouldn't put it past Joan to sit up all night in front of her air-cooled system, puffing away on a carton of cigarettes, to fuck up her lungs. Immediately after the examination, Dr. Gorson of the insurance company gave his report to Aldrich. Joan had a temperature of 99.2. Her white blood cell count was a little over 11,000. But he minimized the importance of the star's ailments and felt that many people walk around in far worse shape than this. Therefore, he could see no reason why the actress couldn't return to work for reasonably full time. Crawford argued with this diagnosis. She complained of fatigue, etc., etc. She told Aldrich she would return only if she would work no more than 2 hours a day. Discussing the matter with Davis and Dick Zanuck that afternoon, the director estimated that at that slow pace it would take 45 more days to complete the film, adding an additional $525,000 to the budget. His solution was to find out once and for all if Crawford was really sick. He wanted to call in a specialist the next day to re-examine Joan. If the specialist agreed with the diagnosis of the insurance doctor, Aldrich would then schedule Crawford for a full day's work next week, and if she failed to perform, declare her in breach of contract. The stage was set. The specialist was called in for the next morning, and Crawford agreed to a second examination. But the super canny star knew she was being set up. She also knew how to give the slip once more to Betty and the director. She called her own doctor. She was feeling much weaker, she told him. Even as they spoke, she could feel her pulse fading. Concerned, the doctor called an ambulance, and at 7 that night, with all sirens blaring, the critical patient was rushed back to Cedars-Sinai Hospital. Protected and isolated, she would remain there for the next 30 days, safe from the rage and suspicions of her wily co-star and director.
I feel terrible. This is the first time I ever held up a picture.
Joan Crawford to columnist Mike Connolly. On Tuesday, August 4th, production on Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte was suspended indefinitely, with the cast and crew retaining full pay. "We sat on our butts for weeks drawing full pay, waiting for Joni to get well," said Bob Gary.
"She was a very, very sick girl," said Peggy Shannon.
"She was sick, all right. Sick of Bette Davis," said Bob Schiffer. "They are using the wrong doctors to diagnose Miss Crawford," said Betty. "They should send for Dr. Menninger." Joan couldn't take any more of Betty's intimidation, Harry Mines believed. This was the only way she could make a positive retreat. But on this retreat, Crawford intended to take the enemy with her. During this relapse, it wasn't her plan merely to hold up production on Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte. She wanted to close the picture down. That way she would save face, and Bette Davis would lose her role and the balance of the $100,000 due her in salary, plus all potential profits. "Fox had closed down my last movie, Something's Gotta Give," said George Cukor, "because no actress wanted to take over for Monroe. The picture was covered by insurance, and I think Joan figured they would do the same thing for her."
"They approached Loretta Young and Barbara Stanwyck. Both are friends of mine and wouldn't dream of taking a job away from me," Crawford told Luella Parsons when her infirmity entered its second week. Wearing a $110,000 sapphire necklace with her hospital gown by Dior, she also posed for an Associated Press photographer. With her meals catered from Chasen's, Joan Crawford is the most glamorous and popular star at the Cedars Celebrity Hospital, wrote Edith Gwynn. The doctors and nurses line up each day for the privilege of taking care of her. "I kept up with her condition by reading Hedda Hopper, who received frequent bulletins from Joan from under her oxygen tent," said Bette Davis. "No one was sure what was going on," said Bob Gary. "Aldrich felt that Joan was doing a job on him, but he couldn't prove it because she had those doctors at the hospital who claimed otherwise." Crawford's friend Vincent Sherman spoke of visiting the star in the hospital. "She called me the second or third week and said she was dying for company. When I got to her room, she jumped out of bed and locked the door. 'I'm not sick,' she said. 'I just couldn't stand working another minute with that Bette Davis.'" Cautioning Bette Davis to say nothing publicly about Joan's mystery illness, lest they lose their insurance. "If she'd been faking, the insurance company would have never paid the claim," Aldrich told Sight and Sound. The director embarked upon his own strategy to combat Joan and save his picture. In a memo to Dick Zanuck dated August 5th, he discussed the possibility of replacing her. "To redo the work involved with another actress would cost us roughly $285,000, plus the cost of the actress, plus the carry before said actress was able to commence," said the director. Zanuck agreed to the extra cost. A replacement should be sought immediately without consulting Crawford. The choice of replacement, however, had to please Bette Davis, who had co-star approval in her contract. Obviously, the ideal candidates would have been Vivien Leigh and Katharine Hepburn, but there are deep-seated personal and historical reasons why she didn't want them, said Aldrich. I had a strong feeling that she didn't really want Hepburn to do it, and I knew Hepburn would probably turn us down no matter what we offered her. The Fox studio wanted Vivien Leigh, but it was said that Bette, still sensitive over the loss of Gone with the Wind some 27 years before, argued that Vivien could not play an authentic Southern character. Scarlett and Blanche Dubois be damned. Dear Bob, said Bette in a handwritten letter to Aldrich on the matter of Vivien Leigh, I will not do Charlotte with the very British Miss Leigh. For Fox to suspend me is nonsense. This is wrong casting. The part is for an American actress, and there are many. You have consulted me all along the line. This answer is no. Why go from the frying pan to the fire? This is what you would be doing. Trust my lousy female instincts. They have been known to be right every now and then. My roses are divine. Thank you so much. Bette. Vivien Leigh reportedly did not want to work with Bette either. In London, when called by a Fox executive about the role, she declined by saying, No, thank you. I can just about stand looking at Joan Crawford's face at 6 o'clock in the morning, but not Bette Davis. Selection number 3 was Olivia de Havilland, who hesitated because of a film she made the previous year, Lady in a Cage. In the first 15 minutes of that movie, her co-star Anne Southern was thrown in a closet, then strangled by some hoods, while the usually genteel and soignée Olivia spent the rest of the film on her hands and knees, tormented in a hot, suspended elevator. Add Olivia's name to the list of movie actresses who would apparently rather be freaks than forgotten, said Life, commenting on her ordeal. When the script of Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte arrived by courier at Olivia's home in Switzerland, followed by a transatlantic call from Bette Davis and Bob Aldrich, Olivia said, Bette, thanks, but no thanks. But Olivia, you must do this picture, said Bette. We need you desperately. Darling, Olivia replied firmly, you know how much I hate to play bitches. They make me so unhappy. Get her to change her mind, Bette said to Aldrich when they had hung up. How? Asked Aldrich. The same way you got Crawford into this mess, she stated. Get on a plane and make Olivia change her mind. 2 days later, after taking 3 planes, a train, and a taxi up a goat trail, Aldrich arrived at Olivia's summer home in the Swiss mountains. They spoke for an entire day and night until the shrewd director made the actress see the character of Miriam in a different light. Instead of being played as a hard, conniving bitch, she should be portrayed as a cool but devious sophisticate. It's always the charming ones of evil intent who are the dangerous ones, Olivia agreed. The others you can see coming, but you can't see Miriam coming, and she's really dangerous.
This upload is made by the concluding chapter of Crawford.
The added lure of the $100,000 in salary, plus living expenses of $1,000 a week for 10 weeks, and first-class air transportation for her, her 2 children, and a nursemaid also helped, and Olivia finally said yes to Aldrich. She and the director then called Bette Davis in Los Angeles and gave her the good news. Aldrich requested that Bette keep the news a secret until he returned to Los Angeles in 2 days, when he would legally inform Crawford and her lawyer by letter. But according to the director, further confusion and treachery then occurred, this time initiated by Bette. She had no intention of waiting 2 days to tell the world that she was finally rid of Joan Crawford. She called her press agent, Rupert Allen, who immediately leaked the story to the press. I heard the news of my replacement over the radio, lying in my hospital bed, said Joan. I wept for 39 hours. Regretting the tactless, aggressive, self-serving efforts of Bette and her staff, Aldrich dismissed the premature announcement with, C'est la goddamn vie. I still believe in this business, but there should be some gentleness, Joan wept further to the press the next day. I think it takes a lot of guts to make pictures, and I'm going to make a lot more of them. But I am going to make them with decent, gentle people. She made all these statements from underneath her oxygen tent, said Bette. The widow Steele even took a crack at Olivia. She said, I'm glad for Olivia. She needs the work. I still get chills when I think of the treachery that Miss Davis indulged in on that movie, Crawford told this writer in 1973. but I refused to ever let anger or hate enter my heart. Years later, Mother would only have to hear the name of Bette Davis mentioned to start a tirade, said Christina Crawford. Bette Davis was the consummate match for my mother's storehouse of tricks and intimidation. She was as shrewd a professional and every bit as indomitable. Producer-director Robert Aldrich would also be showered with scorn by Crawford in the years to come. "He is a man who loves evil, horrendous, vile things," she said.
"If the shoe fits, wear it," said Aldrich. "And I am very fond of Joan."
20. People who wanted to be nice about my looks always would say, "You remind me so much of Bette Davis." Very nice, except I can't stand Bette Davis. Jean Moreau, 1965. On September 9, 1964, when production resumed on Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, it was noted that Bette Davis and Olivia de Havilland bid goodbye and good riddance to Pepsi Queen Joan Crawford by raising their bottles of Coke in a toast to a fresh start and a future triumph. As filming proceeded, even though de Havilland and Davis were close friends, Bette attempted to reassert her position as first star and partner of the production. She was in her usual position of authority, sitting in front of the camera, when Olivia appeared in her opening scene on the mansion stairs. But de Havilland refused to be intimidated by the assertive Bette. She stated, "I am not a competitive person. If I am attacked, I simply refuse to fight back. I never said a word to her. I just did my scene with a look that said, 'I will not fight you. I will not accept your challenge.'" Bette understood. When Charlotte was released early in 1965, critics with a yen for violence applauded the film. Kenneth Tynan said the piece was yanked to the level of art by Miss Davis' performance as the raging, aging Southern belle. This wasted Bernhard, with her screen-filling eyes and electrifying vocal attack, squeezes genuine pathos from a role conceived in cardboard. She has done nothing better since The Little Foxes. Judith Crist also sanctioned the movie. "The blood is on the cleaver, the madwoman is on the loose, the headless corpse is on the prowl, and the guignol is as grand as it can get," said Crist, praising the succulent expertise of Bette and the exquisite refinement of Olivia, while noting that Agnes Moorehead, as the whining po-white trash, just almost walks off with the show. To help the box office, Bette and Olivia made a personal tour of theaters in the East and Midwest. The two stars were squared off evenly, said World Telegram reporter William Pepper, with 2 Oscars each, separate limos, entourages, and personal eccentricities. In one interview, Olivia sweetly told Bette it was a pity she did not get the chance to work with Vivien Leigh. "That would have given you a chance to forgive her for getting Gone with the Wind," said the former Melanie, while Bette roared and spouted cigarette smoke. Skillfully avoiding questions on Joan Crawford, "We don't want to give her more ammunition than she already has, do we, dear?" Bette told John Gruen that she was happy that Crawford had left the picture. "Those repeat duo appearances never really work out," she said. "Look at those Doris Day, Rock Hudson films. They're getting worse by the minute." In Chicago at a press luncheon, while Olivia sipped on a whisper of gin and a whisper of soda, Bette drank straight scotch and puffed on endless cigarettes, inhaling with a finality that seemed to defy the smoke to seep out. Mourning the recent death of Errol Flynn, "I was almost hysterical when I heard the news," said Bette. Olivia smiled and suggested that Bette and Errol had hardly been bosom buddies during their professional days at Warner's. "Shut up, dear," Bette hissed at de Havilland. "How would you like to make this tour with Joan Crawford?" Olivia replied. "And how would you like to make it with Joan Fontaine?" said Bette, as the reporters hastily scribbled their testy jabs in their notepads. In Hollywood that same month, while she was being followed by a team from Look, Bette was approached in a disco by a young girl. "Excuse me," said the young girl, "but are you Miss Joan Crawford?" Bette laughed uproariously and the girl fled. A short time later, spotting the girl crying in a corner, Bette rose and went to her. Putting her arm around her shoulder, the star explained, "We weren't laughing at you, my dear. Miss Crawford is my oldest and bitterest rival. My name is Bette Davis." Angling for another Oscar nomination for Sweet Charlotte, Bette appeared on the Los Angeles talk shows in late January.
When the nominations were released, the film received 7, including Best Song, Best Editing for Michael Luciano, and Best Supporting Actress for Agnes Moorehead. Bette Davis was not included in the final citations. A recovered Joan Crawford was delighted, of course. With Bette out of the running for Best Actress, she was now relieved of the duty of soliciting permission to accept for the other nominees. She had already secured a major spot on the show to present Best Director, and that enabled her to reign supreme backstage on the night of the big show. She told the press she was thrilled to death to meet Patti Page, who was chosen, in lieu of Bette, to sing the title song from Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte on the Oscar cast. That night, Joan also had to grapple with the weighty decision of which of 2 gowns she should wear. Deborah Kerr was scheduled to appear before Crawford. She told the Academy she was wearing white. "I don't trust her. I think she might change at the last minute," said Joan. She told Edith Head to make up the same gown twice, one in white, the other in black, at $3,000 a pop. Miss Kerr wore white, and Joan switched to the black gown. She was the hit of the evening when she presented the award to George Cukor for My Fair Lady, said Miss Head. Queens of Horror. Throughout the 60s, to a new generation, the names of Bette Davis and Joan Crawford were synonymous with horror movies. Of the two, it was Crawford who caused the most damage to her reputation by appearing in a series of cheap, exploitative films that were many watts away from the classic days of Mildred Pierce and Grand Hotel. Stabbed between the ribs, she expired early in her second film for William Castle, I Saw What You Did. For 4 days' work, she received top billing and $50,000. When asked by Harrison Carroll why she was doing the role, Crawford replied, "Because I think the film will have a terrific identity with parents and audiences." Of course she rationalized what she did, said George Cukor. Joan even lied to herself. She would write to me about these pictures, actually believing that they were quality scripts. You could never tell her they were garbage. She was a star, and this was her next picture. She had to keep working, as did Bette. The two of them spawned a regrettable cycle in motion pictures. In 1967, when the offers ran out in Hollywood, Joan Crawford went to England to make Circus of Blood, later retitled Berserk. Dressed in a scarlet ringmaster's jacket and black leotards designed by Edith Head, she played the owner of a traveling circus whose staff are stabbed and garroted to death. Again, the true villain of the story was her troubled daughter, Judy Geeson. When asked by a British interviewer why her real-life actress daughter Christina wasn't asked to play the latter role, Joan snapped, "Because she is much too old for the part." Bette Davis says, "My name goes above the title. I am a star." Yes, she is a star, and a great one. But is it worth playing all those demented old ladies to maintain that status? Myrna Loy. In England that year, Bette also found employment, but she bristled loudly when it was suggested that, like Joan Crawford, she seemed to be specializing in horror films. "Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte" was not a horror film, said Bette. It was the study of a very sad woman who had a terrible thing happen in her life. The Nanny, her new picture in which a British governess knocks a 10-year-old boy unconscious and then tries to drown him in a bathtub, was described by the actress as a problem between a nanny and a young boy. That's the contretemps. During the late 1960s, Davis did make repeated attempts to escape the low-budget horror mold. When Warner Brothers bought the screen rights to Who's Afraid of Virginia Woolf, she campaigned vigorously for the role of the virago, Martha. "I must have it," she told Wanda Hale. "I love those gutty words. I told Mr. Albee that I would kill for the part." When she didn't get the role, Bette said she was shaken. "Though not as shaken as when I learned that Elizabeth Taylor would play it. That's when I really went into shock. Miss Taylor is a darling, but my dear, they must be obviously making another picture." In 1967, Angela Lansbury was starring on Broadway in the musical Mame when Bob Aldrich considered her for the lead in his new movie, The Killing of Sister George. "We met with her in her hotel suite," said Lucas Heller. "When Bob offered her the part of the lesbian, Miss Lansbury became quite offended. 'No, I think not,' she told him. 'I have my fans and reputation to think of.'" Bette Davis was then approached. "I have no qualms about playing a lesbian," she told Leonard Lyons.
I have been married 4 times, so I think my track record speaks for itself." In November 1966, Sheila Graham reported that Davis was also up for a lead role in Valley of the Dolls. She would play Helen Lawson, the tough, neurotic, boozy Broadway star who is said to be an amalgam of several women, including Ethel Merman and Joan Crawford. Jacqueline Suzanne, author of the trash novel, dismissed that speculation. "Ethel Merman was a lady and a philanthropist compared to Joan Crawford," said Suzanne. "If I had known Joan when I was writing Valley of the Dolls, Helen Lawson would have been a monster." She was still a bitch, Helen Lawson, and a strong part, Betty believed, and eager to land the movie role, she became good friends, temporarily, with author Suzanne. A shrewd quid pro quo dealer, Suzanne also used Davis as her entree into what was left of Hollywood society. The two posed for magazine photographs at Betty's rented Malibu beach house. Suzanne also used Davis to push her book in media circles closed to her. Barred from appearing on the Johnny Carson TV show, Suzanne got Betty to plug her book for her. "You know, John," said Betty on the air to Carson, "I just read the most marvelous book. It's called Valley of the Moon." In March 1967, when Betty lost out on Valley of the Dolls and The Killing of Sister George, she went back to England to make The Anniversary, another horror exercise for faint-hearted horror fans. The role of the fiendish, one-eyed mother of 3 sons, one of whom likes to wear ladies' underthings, came to Betty courtesy of Hammer Films, which was co-owned by her British son-in-law's family, the Hymans. "They were Jewish, and Mother still had an aversion to Jews," said BD. "She even tried to get me to change my last name after I married my husband Jeremy. I refused. I told her there was nothing wrong with Jews, they were God's chosen people, and the Hymans were good enough to employ her when no one else would." An affair now and then is good for a marriage. It adds spice, stops it from getting boring. I ought to know. Betty Davis advising BD to cheat on her husband. "Christopher is 25 now and is in Vietnam. He's in Saigon, that's all I know. He's been running ever since he was 5. This is the one place he can't run from. It will make a man of him." Joan Crawford to the New York Post, 1967. By 1968, Betty and Joan had forsaken Hollywood and were living on the East Coast, but in separate states. Davis bought a house in Connecticut near her married daughter. Crawford moved to a smaller apartment at 150 East 69th Street, where, by a wry coincidence, Betty's dentist was also located. "Every time I went there with Betty, I was hoping we'd bump into Crawford in the lobby," said Vic Greenfield, "but it never happened." Greenfield had met Betty in California a few years before. When he relocated to Connecticut, he rented her garage apartment and eventually became employed by her for 5 years. "I was her secretary, and I mean secretary," he said. "That means you babysit. All stars are children. They can't be left alone for a minute. Betty was the first to admit that. They are totally impossible to cope with when it comes to reason and logic. I was fired about once a month, but I was always for her. I liked Betty. It's very difficult to dislike her. She was an Aries with her moon in Gemini, which gives you her mind as twins. Professionally, she was a completely different woman to the one we privately knew. When she was at work, she was always perfect. On the set, she seemed to know everything by osmosis. Without looking, she knew exactly where the camera was. So did Crawford and Turner and Taylor. They were pros, and that was their job." In May 1968, both stars officially turned 60. "The years are just numbers," said the outwardly complacent Crawford. Betty recalled she screamed and stayed in bed all day on her birthday. Old age could be less desperate with a man around the house, Davis agreed, but one who came without a marriage certificate. Since her divorce from Gary Merrill, she had been adamantly opposed to the legal aspects of marriage. "I'd only marry again if I found a man who had $15 million and would sign over half of it to me before the marriage and guaranteed he'd be dead before the year," she stated. But a more thorough review of her life during this time found her less rigid in her criteria for a spouse. She was lonely and considered marrying 3 men during the mid to late 1960s. One was Bob Taplinger, the former head of publicity for Warner's in California, now with a corporate public relations firm in New York. The two re-met on a plane bound for New York, and it was Betty's idea to resume their old romance.
They attended the premiere of The Sound of Music, danced every dance at the party afterward, then spent long weekends together in Connecticut. When Phyllis Battelle of the Hearst Syndicate reported that a wedding might be in the offing, Taplinger skipped around the issue, but Davis said the idea had occurred to her. "Bob asked me to marry him 27 years ago," she told Battelle. "He's so great. When I've mentioned marriage, it's been more or less in kidding form. But it could be fun. Besides, think of the loot. Bob would never dream of getting married without the loot." Taplinger, a bachelor for 56 years, preferred to remain that way, and Betty cast her imposing eyes on other candidates. One suitor had money and social position, she said, but he was a Catholic. His mother sent a priest to her hotel room to talk to Betty about converting. She got the holy man drunk, sent him staggering on his way, and that was the end of my attempt to become a Catholic. Another fiancé visited her in England while she was filming The Anniversary. She was suspicious about his mercenary intentions, so while discussing their forthcoming nuptials, she told him her lawyer insisted he sign a premarital agreement. The next day, when she returned from the film studio, she was informed that her betrothed had packed up and left that afternoon, leaving no word of farewell. "It was a terrible blow to my pride," said Betty. "But that didn't stop her from proposing to men," said Vic Greenfield, all of whom declined because her reputation had obviously preceded her. Publicly, Joan Crawford was also inclined to downplay her desire for another husband. She told one reporter, "Every time I say I hope to remarry, I get letters from retired colonels telling me they understand I am very rich, which I'm not, and that they still have all their teeth, and why don't we get together?" During the mid-60s, she had a discreet but intense affair with an executive at Pepsi-Cola. He promised to leave his wife and children for the star spokeswoman. Instead, under the pressure of an ultimatum from Joan, he left Pepsi for a better position at another company, where he refused to take her calls. Joan was subsequently linked with Nelson Rockefeller, but he wed another. She then proposed to two men, dubious partners for passion, but perfect escorts. One was George Cukor, who displayed a 1966 photograph of Joan in his California home, endorsed with her signature and her offer of marriage. The other candidate was acting guru Lee Strasberg. A recent widower, Strasberg was placed next to Joan at a dinner party in 1967 at the home of Jennifer Jones and David Selznick. The next day, she sent him a letter. "At dinner last night at Jennifer's, you were very sweet to me, and I meant what I said when I asked you to marry me," wrote Joan. "I think we'd make a wonderful couple." Strasberg kept the letter, married a younger woman, and thereafter, to paraphrase actress Ruth Gordon, Crawford drew the veil, retiring reluctantly but gracefully from the War of the Sexes. In one of her last interviews, when pressed by New York Times interviewer Patricia Bosworth for some spicy quotes to match the recent sexual confessions of the older Gloria Swanson, Crawford countered with, "She was talking about the past, wasn't she?" "No," said Bosworth. "She wasn't?" said Joan. "Well, I think it's rather shocking. I'd rather listen to a good poem." Warner Brothers asked me to play Paul Newman's mother in Cool Hand Luke. They offered me $25,000 for one day's work. I said no. I would have been on and off the screen in 3 minutes. That would be a cheat to the audience. Bette Davis. Sure, I'd play an ape if they asked me. Maurice Evans did. Joan Crawford. Without a spouse or other kindred interests to pursue, all that remained to fill the lives of Betty and Joan was their careers. "Work is all there is," said Betty. "Family doesn't last. They all go off. Human relationships, ha! They're a joke." After making another tepid film in England, she went to California to play a retired safecracker with arthritic fingers opposite Robert Wagner in the TV series It Takes a Thief. In Los Angeles that November, she was asked to attend a farewell dinner for studio boss Jack Warner. Not long before, she had castigated Warner for selling her old films to TV. "He received $5 million for the rights to our old movies, and we will not see a penny." But as the former first daughter, she felt it was her duty to salute Papa Jack at his send-off. Among the 1,000 guests who attended the formal sit-down dinner on Stage 7 at the Warner studio were Ruby Keeler, Edward G. Robinson, Joan Blondell, Miriam Hopkins, Claire Trevor, Governor Ronald Reagan, Rosalind Russell, and Frank Sinatra. Missing from the alumni lineup was Joan Crawford. She didn't show because she knew that Bette would be up on the dais ready to slit her throat, said Bette's escort, Vic Greenfield. As it happened, Bette tried to bounce Rosalind Russell from the spotlight. They were both on the dais together, and Bette said to Roz, "I want a picture taken with Mr. Warner." And she pushed her out of the picture, said Greenfield. Jim Waters was an entertainment reporter for Time Life when he saw Joan Crawford perform one of her competitive star performances at a New York restaurant that same year. There was a reception at the 21 Club for Ingrid Bergman and Goldie Hawn, who were in New York to make cactus flower, said Waters. As I was going in, Crawford was getting out of a limo. She apparently had not been invited to the party because in a loud voice she said to the doorman, "What is this? Whose due is this?" He explained that there was a reception in progress upstairs for Ingrid Bergman and Goldie Hawn. Crawford headed straight for the elevator and went upstairs. She made a grand entrance into the party, and the first person she came face-to-face with was her old enemy Gloria Graham, whose husband Tony Ray was the assistant director on Cactus Flower. Joan's face dropped when she saw Graham, but she quickly recovered and proceeded to sweep through the room, taking over the party, which wasn't hard because Goldie Hawn wasn't a star yet, and Ingrid Bergman looked rather dowdy, wearing a dress that looked as if she made it. Warner Brothers sent me a letter saying they wanted to use a clip from Now Voyager in summer of '42. They implied that they wanted to use it as a laugh. My lawyer wrote back saying if they wanted a clip to laugh at, why didn't they choose a scene from one of their current films? Bette Davis. As the 60s segued into the 70s, the drastic cultural changes confused and irritated many, including Crawford and Davis. The hippies, free love, and the political protesters especially annoyed Joan. "Peace and love and all of that is just fine," she said, "but there are limits to be observed. When I was young, I also broke some of the stuffy conventional rules, but damn it, we obeyed the laws, respected our elders, and we always earned our own way. The kids today say they don't trust anyone over 30. Does this apply to their parents, who seem to be paying for their freedom and rebellion?" Bette Davis favored the legalization of marijuana. "It is the forbidden fruit element that attracts," she said. "If pot is legalized, I think the young might fall away from it." She also decried the lack of personal grooming on some of the new generation. "I think the parents of the revolutionaries have given up," she told Show magazine. "For example, if my husband ever grew his hair to his shoulders and did not bathe, and he's about 6 foot and I'm a shrimp, I'd cut his hair off in the middle of the night and I'd dump him in a tub." The great unwashed were not the audience Joan Crawford had in mind either for her 1971 book, My Way of Life. "Entertain, decorate, be sexy for your husband," Joan advised, giving tips on posture. "Sit on hard chairs, soft ones spread the hips. Cooking, a red vegetable next to a yellow one looks unappetizing. How to pack for a trip. Stuff the sleeves of your dresses with tissue so they won't wrinkle. And how to be a perfect house guest in the country. Have breakfast in your room and never see your hosts until lunch." In the book, Joan, the Pepsi board member, published her work schedule opening new bottling plants, from San Diego to Copenhagen to Sao Paulo. The timing and precision were that of a West Point cadet officer. "Arrive at the plant at 10, the schedule stated. At 10:10 we have the invocation. At 10:15 platform guests and speakers are introduced. At 10:45 we start touring the plant, and from 11 to 12 I'm on the platform signing autographs. On the dot of noon I head for the airport for our next destination." "The old bitch just wants everyone to know how busy she is," said Bette Davis. "She's like a goddamn robot." Keeping her cannon well-oiled, Joan then fired off her rebuttal to Bette. "I'm the quiet one, and Betty's explosive," she told Life in 1971. "I have discipline. She doesn't." "My head is high as to my discipline as an actress. I can provide witnesses," Davis shot back, which led Crawford to disparage further her rival's following. "She has a cult," said Joan. "And what the hell is a cult except a gang of rebels without a cause? I have fans. There's a big difference." The ladies who lunch.
Although the two women claimed repeatedly that they preferred the company and friendship of men, both stars had a steady circle of female friends over the years. Crawford had more than Davis, retaining a steady acquaintanceship with dozens of other actresses by phone, but mostly through her voluminous correspondence. Her contacts included Vivian Leigh, Myrna Loy, Marlena Dietrich, Rosalind Russell, Nancy Kelly, Virginia Gray, and such diverse talents as Barbara Stanwyck and Debbie Reynolds. Reynolds became friends with Joan at the start of the 1950s, during her early days at MGM. "It wasn't a close friendship," said the musical comedy star. "It was superficial in that respect, but it was consistent and endured." They had the same masseuse, Nancy Giano, and Joan was one of the first to call Debbie when Eddie Fisher left her for Elizabeth Taylor. She offered her home to me and the children if we wanted to get away from the press. When Reynolds married shoe tycoon Harry Carl, she and Joan frequently lunched at the 21 Club in New York. It was always on the second floor, the same corner table at the front of the room, so Joan could see and be seen by everyone who entered. On those occasions, Crawford wore a big hat, drank Russian vodka, so you couldn't smell it on her breath, and was always warm and amiable. "I never knew the bad side of her," said Debbie. "She was always very sweet and kind to me." Visitors to Crawford's New York apartment commented that the only photographs displayed in the star's living room were one of President John F. Kennedy and one of Barbara Stanwyck. Approximately the same age, Crawford and Stanwyck began as hoofers on Broadway in the mid-1920s and went to Hollywood to star in silent movies not long after. In the early 1930s, when Stanwyck was married to actor Frank Fay, she lived in Brentwood, close enough to Crawford to find refuge in her house when Fay went into his alcoholic rages. In 1935, when newcomer Robert Taylor was making MGM's The Gorgeous Hussy, the sight of the gorgeous young actor with the coal-black hair, blue eyes, and double eyelashes sent the star of that picture, Joan Crawford, into spasms of ecstasy. But it was a look-but-don't-touch situation for Joan, because Taylor was the steady boyfriend of the slightly older Barbara Stanwyck. "He's got a lot to learn, and I've got a lot to teach," who, according to one reporter, would kick Joan right in the butt if she even so much as touched a hair on Taylor's fine head in private. Joan really liked Stanwyck. She never had anything but wonderful things to say about her, writer Carl Johns recalled. It was always a kind of bond between them that the crews on their pictures used to call Stanwyck Missy and Joan Crawford Miss C. On a visit to New York in the early 1970s, Stanwyck had lunch with Crawford at the 21 Club. Also at the table was Stanwyck's close friend, reporter Shirley Eder, who wrote up the meal in a book. Dispensing with menus, Joan ordered calf's liver for all three. "She also chose our vegetables and the salad, leaving the choice of our dessert to us," said Eder. When Joan got up to greet someone in another part of the room, Stanwyck said, "I hate calf's liver." "Why didn't you tell her?" Eder asked. "I wouldn't dare," said the star. On a subsequent occasion, prior to one of her work trips to California, Eder said that Crawford made plans to see Stanwyck for dinner when she arrived. At noon that day, Joan's secretary, Betty Barker, called Stanwyck. Miss Crawford was on a plane en route from New York to L.A., Barker told the Star, and she planned to see her at Don the Beachcombers for dinner at 5 p.m. 5 p.m.? Stanwyck asked. "Who eats dinner at that ungodly hour? Why do we have to meet so early?" "Because of the time difference," the secretary replied. "Miss Crawford's stomach will be on Eastern Standard Time." "Well, you tell Miss Crawford that Miss Stanwyck's stomach is on California time and has been for the past 30 years, the classy silver-haired legend replied, declining to dine with Joan on that trip. "It's a strange friendship, but nevertheless it's real," said Shirley Eder. "And every year on Joan's birthday there was a big floral gift from Stanwyck," said Carl Johns. "It was always signed, 'From Missy to Miss C.'" Betty and Olivia. "In my day, the most beautiful actresses in Hollywood were Hedy Lamarr and Rita Hayworth. And the most liked were Carole Lombard and Jean Harlow. But I never did pal around with actresses. Their talk usually bored me to tears." Betty Davis. In December each year, a select group of actresses received a Christmas card from Betty. They included Agnes Moorehead, Joan Blondell, both on Crawford's list, Claire Trevor, and Deborah Kerr.
She was also friendly with Marlene Dietrich without sending cards or letters, said Secretary Vic Greenfield. Once they were in the same hospital in Philadelphia on the same floor, and Marlene sent a note that said, "Dear Betty, get well soon, but please no visitations. Love, Marlene." There was also her best friend, Olivia de Havilland. They were never really that close, said Beatty Hyman. In later years, Olivia always visited Mother when she was in the States, and if Mother was in the mood, she called Olivia when she was in Europe. "I think they're as close as actresses can be," said Vic Greenfield. "Olivia has a great admiration for Betty. It is not returned. Since they were girls at Warner's together, Betty always had the upper hand, so she, I hate to use the word, tolerates Olivia. And Olivia really, really likes Betty." Betty and Kate. "I wanted to be the first to win 3 Oscars, but Miss Hepburn has done it. Actually, it hasn't been done. Miss Hepburn only won half an Oscar. If they'd given me half an Oscar, I would have thrown it back in their faces. You see, I'm an Aries. I never lose." Bette Davis. She was a fan of only 2 actresses, Davis said repeatedly. One was Garbo, the other was Katharine Hepburn. She always wanted to have Hepburn's face, with its hollows and high cheekbones, she told entertainment reporter Robert Osborne. "When I hit 40, I screamed every time I saw a mirror, but Miss Hepburn, with her bone structure, could look good at 100. "She's awfully good," Hepburn said, as a sparse tribute to Davis, while Betty occasionally acknowledged she was amenable to working with the great Kate. Early in 1936 at RKO, when Hepburn had been cast as Mary, Queen of Scots, Davis wanted the role opposite her, Elizabeth, the Tudor Queen. One report claimed Jack Warner refused to loan her out, while another said it was director John Ford who booted her off the set because Betty talked too much. "I always thought Mary was an absolute jackass," said Hepburn, regretting that she hadn't played Elizabeth herself. In the decades to come, Hepburn and Davis were considered as co-stars for other projects, including The Great Lie, The Night of the Iguana, and Ship of Fools. But the kinetic pairing never occurred. In March 1977, the New York Times reported that the 2 actresses were scheduled to work together in Whitewater, a film based on a novel about 2 spirited women in a small Texas town during the 1940s. The scheduled director was Jan Cotter, who said there would be a pivotal confrontation scene between the 2. But which of the 2 formidable stars would win the showdown and first billing was not announced. Whitewater was never made. In 1985, Life attempted to bring the 2 legends together for a photo layout. Entertainment editor Jim Waters was in charge of the magazine's special movie issue. For the cover, he persuaded the current female powers, Jane Fonda, Barbra Streisand, Jessica Lange, and Sally Field, to pose for a group portrait. For the closing shot, he wanted Katharine Hepburn and Bette Davis seated side by side. "I felt it would be a historic picture," said Waters. "The 2 didn't know each other, but they represented all that was great about Hollywood." Waters sent a letter to each actress outlining his concept. Betty answered first with a telephone call. "This is a fantastic idea," she said. "Truly inspiring." Hepburn did not respond. "I wrote her a second note," said Waters, saying, "Why are you ignoring me?" In the meantime, Davis kept calling me. "I am coming to New York to do these photographs with Miss Hepburn," she said, "but apparently Miss Hepburn doesn't want to do them. What is wrong with her? She must do this. Contact her again." The third note apparently moved Hepburn. Waters answered his phone one day and heard a familiar voice bellowing at him from the other end. "This is Kate Hepburn, and why are you making my life miserable?" she barked. She wouldn't pose with Davis, she declared. "Oh, I can see your mind just clicking away, that this is one of those things where you get 2 old dames together and we'd be embarrassed to back out because one would blame the other. But I am saying no because it is a shitty idea and because I have done enough for Life magazine. The last time you didn't even put me on the cover." We had a wonderful private look at Kate's domain in Connecticut and a strong Mick Jagger story, but the photo editor went with an embryo on the cover, said Waters. Hepburn could not be swayed by the historical significance of the photograph or the fact that Bette Davis was hot for the idea. "Well, I'm not going to do it," said Kate. "I did enough shit for Life." She kept using that word 20 times in 2 minutes, Waters recalled.
"Forget the shitty idea, and don't write again, and don't call me," said the intractable one.
"Then she hung up in my ear by slamming down the receiver," said the editor, who had to tell Bette Davis that Hepburn wouldn't pose with her.
"Is she crazy?" Betty roared. "The woman is nuts."
Davis was not happy, to say the least, said Waters, but I managed to calm her down by assuring her that Life would be very happy to photograph her on her own, which we did.
The camera doesn't know how to lie. There is a thing, God help us, called close-ups. There is no place to return to when you retire from the movies.
Alexandra Del Lago in Sweet Bird of Youth. By 1972, the movie careers of Bette and Joan were apparently over. Joan had made her last feature 2 years before, playing an anthropologist in Trog. Her leading man was an 8-foot troglodyte monster, but the star behaved as though she were appearing opposite Cary Grant or Clark Gable. She supplied her own wardrobe, arriving on location in the gray English moors with 38 pieces of luggage. She had her face taped back by gifted hairstylist Ramon Guy, and divulged one of her special beauty secrets to a woman's magazine writer.
"There's a trick Claudette Colbert taught me years ago," said Joan. "Dump a tray of ice in your wash basin and splash ice water on your bazooms. It keeps them firm."
In 1971, Bette Davis made her last film for 5 years, Bunny O'Hare. Wearing a hippie dress, a long blonde wig, and a floppy granny hat, she played a bank robber bored with her family and retirement. "Silly, a gimmick, dreadful," said Vincent Canby, panning the film and the star, whose career, which began 40 years ago, has been recycled more often than the average rubber tire. With no offers for features, Davis and Crawford grabbed whatever work they could in TV.
"I want to do more guest spots," Crawford told TV Guide. "I was dying to do a Doctari or an I Spy. I was desperate to work with Judy, the chimp in Doctari, and with Gentle Ben. When I read that Clarence the Cross-Eyed Lion died, I sent a telegram to the producer, Ivan Tors."
Lucille Ball used Crawford in one of her revivified comedy series on TV. The script, not written for Joan, exploited one of her fetishes, her mania for cleaning. The plot had Lucy and her sidekick, Vivian Vance, with a broken-down car, stopping at a Hollywood mansion and finding the occupant, a once great star, down on her hands and knees scrubbing the floors. Assuming the star was destitute, Lucy and Ethel then arranged a charity auction to help her. Gloria Swanson was being talked of for the role of the star when Stan Kamen, Crawford's agent at William Morris, said, "Why not give it to Joan?" "She won't sue us?" said Lucy. "She loves your show," said Kamen. "She'd be delighted to play herself." During rehearsals, Crawford, terrified of appearing before a live studio audience, frequently forgot her lines and came close to being fired by Lucy, the co-producer. But Lucy, the actress, tried to relax the great star. Between breaks, as Joan sat in her chair with her nose in her purse, Lucy, no shy violet, went over and teased her with, "What you got in there?" Then she snapped open Crawford's purse. The star was drinking 100 proof vodka from a brown paper bag with 2 straws. "And all these years she's been so refined," said the item in McCall's. Bette Davis also clashed with Lucille Ball, but not over a mere TV guest star job. At stake was the multi-million-dollar musical Mame. When Warner's bought the movie rights, Bette asked her agent to submit her name. "I wanted the lead," she said. "I had agreed to test and pay for my own wardrobe. Then when Lucy was signed, I said, what about the other role, as Vera Charles, the close friend to Mame? Everyone thought it was a divine idea. After all, I knew Miss Ball. We were old buddies. We attended the same dramatic school in New York many years before. Then the word got back to me that Miss Ball didn't want 2 stars in the same picture. I said, forget the star billing, put me in a special box at the end of the credits, or leave my name off entirely. I could be a mystery guest. But no, Miss Ball would have none of that. It was her show, and she was determined to sink it alone." In August 1972, Davis and Crawford were working at the same TV studio, Universal. Bette was starring in a pilot film for a potential series, The Judge and Jake Weiler. Joan was a guest star in a segment of Sixth Sense. Of the two, Bette had the larger salary and assignment, scheduled for 10 days' work.
Joan was there for 3 days and was paid a paltry $2,500, but she was given her customary perks: a studio limousine, her own bungalow, and fresh flowers each day. "That shows the difference between the two," said Vic Greenfield. "Betty had this little dressing room and she took her meals alone, as she preferred." One day, Davis instructed her secretary to go and see what Crawford was up to. "After lunch, I went off and watched Joan come out of her bungalow," he said. "She had 5 men as escorts, and she had her hands on each one of theirs. They escorted her like this fragile queen down to her limousine, and then they all drove off to the lot, which was 1.5 blocks away. I didn't follow because if someone pointed out who I was, there would have been a scene." Each afternoon of her 3-day stay, Joan was visited by such studio notables as Lew Wasserman, Bette and Joan's former agent, now president of the studio, Alfred Hitchcock, Rock Hudson, and producer Aaron Spelling, who invited Joan to dinner to meet his new bride, Candy. "This was before Aaron made it big," said Dynasty designer Nolan Miller, "and Candy wore a pair of wispy diamond earrings at dinner. Crawford quickly took Mr. Spelling aside and told him, 'Until you can afford to buy your wife important pieces of jewelry, don't buy her anything.'" Photographer George Harrell was also called to the set to photograph Joan. He recalled the occasion for Interview magazine. "How she ever got through or how she remembered her lines except when they held up a card, I don't know." Crawford started the morning off with 100-proof vodka over ice and was partial to complaining to the veteran artist. She was Georging me and all that, asking, "Why don't they give me a series? Why don't they?" All she wanted to do was work as a star. The producers were sore as hell about it, but they had to cater to her or else. At the conclusion of filming, Joan attended the Friday night wrap party. Slightly drunk, she gave gifts to each member of the cast, shook hands with the crew, then departed in her limousine. As she was driven out of the studio, the irony of the situation was not evident, said writer Hector Arce. This would be her very last job in Hollywood. She was ending her career playing a small part in a TV film at the same studio where Bette Davis began her career 40 years before. And the title of her last film was Dear Joan, We're Going to Scare You to Death. Women's lib, poor little things. They always look so unhappy. Have you noticed how bitter their faces are? Joan Crawford. Gay liberation? I ain't agin it. It's just that there's nothing in it for me. Bette Davis. Strangely enough, at the same time the studios stopped making new Davis and Crawford features, the demand for their old movies increased. Classic pictures such as All About Eve and Mildred Pierce were becoming cult favorites at revival houses and on college campuses across America. Part of the renewed interest was due to a national nostalgia craze that began in 1971 with the opening of No No Nanette on Broadway. The fascination with the past was described by life writer Loudon Wainwright as a longing for the irrecoverable, to stave off preoccupation with a future in which there is only one predictable, entirely unsentimental outcome. Coupled with their renewed popularity from the nostalgia boom, Bette and Joan also learned they had become leading icons of another growing force, the gay liberation movement. In March 1953, Lawrence Quirk, author of The Films of Joan Crawford and writer, editor, and publisher of his own newsletter, offered his timely thesis, The Cult of Bette and Joan, the true reasons why they drive homosexuals wild. Analyzing the frenzied, high-camp element involved in the gay preoccupation with Davis and Crawford, Quirk said the stars mirrored certain frenzied, posturing, arrogant, prima donna-ish, ego-deifying, self-projective, supercompensating principles that psychologists and psychiatrists have spotted in the more aggressive and flamboyant homosexuals, especially those in show business. Using multiple metaphors, similes, and parallels, Quirk pointed to Bette in Now Voyager. In that, she was mother-dominated, fat, and unattractive, but she transformed herself into a swan and landed herself a beautiful man, which was exactly the same scenario as many a gay gone New York way via Florida or some godforsaken hinterland. Then there was Joan Crawford in The Damned Don't Cry, busting out of a dull small town and using a ladder of men to get a plushy pad, groovy duds, etc. culminating in a Gotterdammerung of masochistic hell let loose with a fast fall back to the gutter. Many a homosexual could identify with that, too, Quirk opined. And with Joan in Possessed, when she shoots the man she can't have, offering gays vicarious purgation because, being essentially non-violent, they prefer to watch Joan Crawford do the killing for them. Men, money, and power. These were the three things the two actresses were in aggressive, intent pursuit of, the author said in summation, and that was why the typical cross-section homosexual got a bang out of old Bette and Joan movies. "Your article was very informative," Joan Crawford told Quirk, as Bette Davis was more expansive for Playboy. "Homosexuals are probably the most artistic and appreciative human beings who worship films and theater," she said. "Certainly I've been one of the artists they admire very much. It was always said that Judy Garland and I had the biggest following, but I don't think it's fair to say it's because I'm flamboyant. I'm not flamboyant. In my personal life, I've never been known as flamboyant. Joan Crawford was flamboyant." The race goes on. In May 1970, Joan Crawford was presented with an award of achievement from her old alma mater, Stevens College, which she had attended for a grand total of 2 months in her youth. The college, eager to get as much coverage as possible from the star's return, held a press conference for newspaper and TV reporters from St. Louis and Kansas City. Among those present was future author Alana Nash, then a sophomore at the school. Weeks after the event, the student writer was surprised to receive a typewritten, personally signed letter from Miss Crawford, thanking her for attending the press conference. "I soon learned," said Nash, "that everyone in the room had received a similar thank you. This was my introduction to the incredible Crawford efficiency." Nash responded by sending Joan her story on the star's visit to Stevens. "And thus began a correspondence and a friendship that would last for the next 8 years, said the young writer. In 1972, Carl Johns was an assistant story editor at Columbia Pictures, when he too became friends with the star. One day at work, he was assigned to go and help Crawford pack her books and papers for dispatch to Brandeis University, where her collection was stored. "I beat Bette Davis in that department," Joan crowed to Carl, pleased that her bestowal had preceded Betty's donation to Boston University. "This was the first of a series of wry outbursts on the subject of their famous rivalry that I was treated to over the next 5 years," Johns recalled. One favorite tale, delivered by Joan in a flawless imitation of Bette Davis, recounted the time in 1943 when the two rivals met at Warner Brothers. "When she first went to the studio, Joan told me she tried very hard to make peace with Davis," said Johns. "She went to her one day and said, 'Betty, we are now at the same studio. We have the same boss, the same friends in New York. We've had a similar career.' And Davis listened to all this. Then, waving her arms and popping her eyes, she said, 'So what?' which Crawford mimicked perfectly." In November 1971, Davis was honored with a day at the prestigious Players Club in New York. "She arrived looking very chic," said Sanford Doty, co-author of her book, The Lonely Life. "At 1 o'clock in the afternoon, she was wearing a little suit and sables. She was every inch Miss Margot Channing." The following year, Joan Crawford had her day at the Gramercy Park Club. She arrived in a peekaboo dress, fuck-me shoes, and her hair was blown out. "She looked like a dress manufacturer's lay for the night," said Doty. For sustenance, the star carried a huge handbag which housed her usual bottle of vodka. "We showed her movie A Woman's Face," Doty recalled. "And afterwards, across the room, she gave me the eye and beckoned to me. I went over with a guest and introduced myself. After I had mentioned that I had written Betty's autobiography, Joan looked at me and said, 'Oh!' Then she fled to the John with her handbag, and we didn't see her sober for the rest of the afternoon. She was truly wild." The marked difference between Crawford and Davis, the author believed, was that Joan never truly knew who she was, ever. She was very insecure as a person. She never had that center of gravity that Bette Davis had. From the minute Bette Davis came out of the womb, she screamed her name to the moon. She was also a very great artist. That artistry gave her a very strong center, whereas Crawford, although I think she's underestimated as a movie actress, was never a great performer. Some of her old movies are excellent, but she never had the acting ability of Betty. Film critic Judith Christ agreed. Bette was an actor who was also a movie star. She had the impact, the gestures, and everything else. She was unique, complete. Her only equal today is Meryl Streep. Joan Crawford, on the other hand, was a product of the movies. She was created shot by shot. She could not have a life of her own upon a stage. That's the difference. The ultimate test. A call from Bette and Joan. In 1973, veteran publicist John Springer launched his popular series, Legendary Ladies of the Movies, at Town Hall in New York City. The series featured clips of movies, followed by a personal appearance and question-and-answer period with the featured star. The first legends announced were Bette Davis, Myrna Loy, Sylvia Sidney, and Jean Arthur. Arthur, terrified of any appearance, withdrew, and Springer asked Ginger Rogers to step in. Ginger accepted, then canceled when the news was prematurely announced by a columnist. "Could I possibly approach Joan Crawford?" Springer asked, knowing her fear of live audiences. "If it means a lot to you, I'll do it," said Joan. But first on the bill, as always, came Bette Davis. On the night of February 4th, 1973, a medley of her greatest film hits opened the series at Town Hall. Swamp fevers, gunshot wounds, bubonic plague, the deaths of countless lovers, the brain tumor to end all brain tumors, car accidents, shipwrecks, beatings at the hands of the syndicate, and suicide on the Chicago train tracks. She has survived them all, said columnist Rex Reed. "Fasten your seatbelts, it's going to be a bumpy night," said Bette in the last clip from All About Eve. The frame faded, the house lights came up, and the stars swept in from the wings. Halting mid-stage, she threw a wave toward the balcony, then bowed from the waist at the roar of acclaim from her fans. "I will never forget that welcome as long as I live," she told them, before sitting down to answer questions from her audience. Where did she get her famous walk? "I never planned it that way. It's part of my zest for life." Would she marry again? No, my dear. The point is, who'd consider marrying me? And what is your professional opinion of Joan Crawford? I would not presume to answer that, said Bette, cutting the topic short. 8 weeks later, on April 5th, it was Crawford's turn at Town Hall. She had prepared herself, said Springer. A Crawford spy was at all the preceding shows. She knew exactly how Bette Davis entered, how Myrna Loy took her bows. Following clips from her greatest hits, Grand Hotel, The Women, Mildred Pierce, Sudden Fear, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Joan was pushed from the wings into the spotlight on stage. The volume and length of her ovation, greater than Betty's, she would boast, stunned, then dissolved the legend. Grateful tears dripped from her eyes to the floor, said Village Voice reporter Arthur Bell. But somehow the mascara stayed intact. So did the famous shoulders, the mouth, the shoes. Responding to written questions, Joan was asked if she knew the name for her famous ankle-strapped shoes. It starts with an F, said Crawford, and I think, if you remember, they held me up a goddamn long time. She said she enjoyed playing mean women, because there's a little bit of a bitch in every woman, and a lot in every man.
This upload is made by the concluding chapter of Crawford.
And what was it like to work with Bette Davis? It was one of the greatest challenges I ever had, said Joan seriously. Pausing to allow the laughter from the audience to taper off, she added, I meant that kindly. Bette is of a different temperament than I. Bette had to yell every morning. I just sat and knitted. I knitted a scarf from Hollywood to Malibu. It was probably the most threatening scarf since Madame Defarge's, said Beth Fallon of the Daily News. Put up your dukes, Bette, Addison Verrill advised in Variety. The following Saturday morning, the phone rang in this writer's apartment. On the other end was Bette Davis, calling from her home in Connecticut. She was responding to an interview request I had made to talk about The Catered Affair, one of her favorite movies. After discussing the film, she segued easily to other topics. Hollywood, her other films, her advancing age. Like Margot Channing, Bette loathed the march of time and the inevitable aging process. I turned 65 a week ago, she said. It was a tragedy. I thought 60 was bad, but this is the pits. There is nothing good about growing old. As the conversation was drawing to a close, I wondered if it would be prudent to talk of Joan Crawford, whom I had seen at Town Hall the previous week. First, I had assumed that Davis had already heard about the event. Second, I was sure that when the subject of Crawford came up, she would offer her usual terse no comment. But when I mentioned the evening to her, it was apparent that this was her first feedback. "God," said Davis, her voice rising with interest. "I would have given anything to have been a fly on the wall at that thing. Tell me, how did it go?" I mentioned that Miss Crawford had been nervous at first, but eventually rose to the occasion and fielded the questions and answers quite well. "And the clips? Were there enough?" Miss Davis asked, as if to suggest that her rival didn't have that many good films to fill an evening. "The clips were sensational," I said. "Very entertaining." "Oh," said Betty. "And which ones were those?" "Mildred Pierce, Sudden Fear, some of the musicals, and Whatever Happened to Baby Jane." "Yes, Jane. A good film," said Davis. "She spoke about working with you," I ventured. "Of course she did," said Betty. "And what did Joan say?" Without mentioning the long scarf to Malibu crack, I repeated the quote Crawford had given about its being the greatest challenge of her life to work with her. "A challenge?" said Betty, leaping into the fight ring again. "Did she tell the audience how she gave everyone such a hard goddamn time on Jane? How she held up production day after day because she didn't like the way she looked? That she was frequently so drunk she had to stop the cameras and put her glasses on to read her cue cards? When we were finished, she refused to help me publicize the picture, and then, when I was nominated for an Oscar for Jane and she wasn't, Miss Crawford went to New York and began to campaign against me." After pausing to light a cigarette and take a swig from whatever she was drinking at that early hour, Davis told how Joan had had the absolute gall to solicit permission from the other nominated actresses to accept the award should they win. And then, on the night of the Oscars, she was determined to steal the show from me. When Anne Bancroft's name was announced, Joan almost laughed in my face. She went out on stage and took that statue as if it were her own. Then she wouldn't part with it. It was a year before she even let Miss Bancroft take a look at her prize. Winding down, Betty laughed at her own anger, then spoke of the major difference between her and Crawford. "We were completely different kinds of women. She was, women like Crawford, they're the ones that first made the town like it was. Let's face it, there were two groups. There were the theater people who came out, but we didn't have that same kind of Hollywood thing. If we only had that, the town would never have been what it became. And Crawford was definitely one of them. But we must hand it to her. Where she came from and all that, she accomplished much. She became a movie star, and I became the great actress. There is, of course, a need for both in this business, but you have to know when to put a stop to the nonsense that goes with the job. Stars are people, too. They have to eat, sleep, and go to the bathroom, too, without applause or standing ovation. But I don't think Joan Crawford ever sleeps. She never quits being Joan Crawford. I find that tedious and quite insane. Yes, in that area, Joan is not too bright." That evening, after transcribing the interview with Betty, I had dinner with a writer friend from California, Hector Arce, who at the time was working with George Cukor on his autobiography. During the dinner, I mentioned Davis and repeated some of her quotes on Joan Crawford. A former entertainment reporter for Women's Wear Daily and well-grounded on Hollywood history, Hector offered some of his insights on the star-crossed duo. He also, I later learned, passed some of Betty's remarks about Joan along to her good friend George Cukor. 3 days later, on Tuesday night, I received another call. The voice on the other end this time belonged to Joan Crawford. My acquaintanceship with Miss Crawford was slight. She wrote to me once for a story I was working on, and later we were introduced in the back room of P.J. Clark's restaurant on 3rd Avenue in New York. That meeting was pleasant and brief, but Joan Crawford remembered. On the phone, after some preliminary small talk, she got to the critical item. She had heard that I was doing a story on Bette Davis and that Miss Davis had made some slanderous remarks about their working relationship. Before I could explain that my story wasn't on Bette Davis, Crawford, also in her cups I suspected, had launched her own defense. As far as she was concerned, it wasn't proper etiquette to badmouth a professional colleague to the press. Those in a position of influence who possess any semblance of class or ethics should never talk ill of anyone in the same industry. said the star. "Unfortunately, Miss Davis chooses to abuse that standard time and time again." She had no intention of descending to Miss Davis' level of disclosure, except to say that she admired her enormously as an actress, but not as a human being. How could she when Betty was so contemptuous of her fellow actresses? "She loathes most women," said Joan. "She thinks like a man, talks like a man. On the set of Baby Jane, after one of her many unpleasant outbursts, she said out loud, 'Boy, if I had been born with a penis, my life would have been different.'" Without a link, Crawford jumped tracks from flailing at Davis to praising the talents of actress Lee Grant. "She's got it, doesn't she?" said Crawford. "I went to see her on Broadway last year in the Neil Simon play The Prisoner of Second Avenue. It was an exciting experience. The audience stood up and applauded when I arrived. People can be so kind. Can you hold on a minute, dear?" I held on while Crawford spoke to someone in the background or on another line. When she returned, she thanked me for calling her. "My pleasure," I replied, thinking it was a moot point to remind her that she had made the call. And who would argue with Joan Crawford anyway? In closing, I did manage to slip in a word of appreciation for Mildred Pierce, which had been shown on TV some weeks before. That compliment brought another 15 minutes with the legend. "Did you see it too?" Joan asked warmly. "I received so many calls and letters from friends about it. It was on at such an ungodly hour that I thought no one would watch it. Also, the last time it was shown on TV, the commercials came every 8 minutes. I dropped a note to the station owner about that, and it worked. This time they shut up with the interruptions and let us do our stuff. It pleases me so much that the movie still holds up." "Whatever happened to Baby Jane holds up also," I volunteered. "Yes, in a strange way it does," said Crawford. "It was a good movie, but not as good as it could have been. They tricked me, you know." "They?" "Bob Aldrich and Bette Davis," she said. "But let's not open that can of worms again." Oh, please, let's, I thought, looking for a way of getting the old feud train rolling again. "Mr. Aldrich found the book," I offered. "No, he did not," said Joan. "I found the book." Crawford explained that a friend had sent her the book when it was first published in 1961. "I read it and went out and bought 3 copies. I sent one to Nicholas Ray, one to Alfred Hitchcock, and the third to Bob Aldrich. He was the first to option it. He wanted me for Blanche, and he suggested Katharine Hepburn for Jane. I insisted on Bette Davis. I also brought Mr. Aldrich and Miss Davis together. Then later, for their own selfish, neurotic reasons, they teamed up against me." Furthermore, Betty's story about her hijacking Anne Bancroft's Oscar was an outright lie. "I never campaigned against Miss Davis. The Oscar went to Anne Bancroft because she deserved it. After it was engraved, I presented the statue to Miss Bancroft in New York. It was a week or 2 later, and not 6 months or a year, as Miss Davis claimed. And I would appreciate it if you would set the record straight on this in your story." The next day, a letter with Joan Crawford embossed on the back arrived. Inside the blue envelope was a clipping of a newspaper photograph. It showed the star presenting the Oscar to Anne Bancroft backstage at the Royale Theatre in New York after a performance of Mother Courage. Over the clip, marked in ink, was the inscription, "Taken in New York 1 week after the Oscars." I forwarded the clipping to Bette Davis in Connecticut, together with an original illustration of her by artist Michael Valbracht for possible use as an insert for a book she was working on. The illustration appeared on the jacket of the hardcover book, Mother Goddamn, but Betty preferred to ignore Crawford's clip and correction. In the years to come, she would continue to tell the Oscar hijack story until it became the established version. "It plays better that way," said Hector Arce. "Betty is a legend and a star, and she feels she's entitled to rewrite the facts as she sees fit. After all, it's life. Her picture show." Author's note. In 1987, after Davis put the story in This and That, her second book of memoirs, and repeated it on the Johnny Carson TV show, I asked actress Anne Bancroft if she could set the record straight. Miss Bancroft responded, "Crawford is right. She brought the award to me sometime shortly after the awards, while Mother Courage was still playing on Broadway." 21. The Twilight Years.
In 1973, the success of the legendary Ladies at Town Hall series brought offers of work for Bette and Joan. Producer Morton Gottlieb asked Crawford to appear in his hit play, Sleuth. It would be revised, rehearsed, and performed in a lengthy out-of-town tour before bringing Joan to Broadway. She turned it down, saying she preferred to do the O'Neill plays, the Mothers. I'm anxious to do something like that. She was also asked by NBC to appear as the guest target on a Dean Martin TV celebrity roast. When told that Governor Ronald Reagan, Kirk Douglas, and Jimmy Stewart had gamely appeared and been lampooned on the show, Crawford scowled. No, I don't think an hour of insults is funny. I don't have that much of a sense of humor about myself or my work. Bette Davis was not as touchy about her legend. She agreed to be roasted by Dean and his guests. She also accepted a bit part as the alcoholic mother of a psychopathic killer in a TV suspense movie, Scream, Pretty Peggy. In March 1974, with no other offers to accept, Davis decided to play herself on a tour of theaters and auditoriums across America. She and John Springer took her one-woman question-and-answer tour to Saratoga, Princeton, Denver, and 26 other cities, then on to Australia, New Zealand, and England. "Is that your real hair, Miss Davis?" one fan asked in Scotland. "Yes, it is," said Davis. It wasn't. "And these are my real eyes, my real teeth, and my real tits." Traveling with Bette as her hairdresser was Peggy Shannon, who performed the same duties for Joan Crawford for many years. "I was with Joan for 15 years and with Bette for 12, said Shannon. Bette seemed to not remember that Shannon had worked with Crawford on Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. In 1974, she needed someone for her tour, and a makeup man from Green Acres told her about me, said the hairstylist. Then when we were in London, the newspapers said that I had been with Miss Crawford for a long time. "You never mentioned it," said Bette. "It was work. Who cares? Why should I mention it?" said Shannon in 1988, proud to recall that she had worked on the heads of some of the most famous women in Hollywood. "I was with MGM and 20th Century Fox during the 1950s, she said. Stars were really stars back then. Not like the kids today. They work on one television series and they think they're stars. They don't know what a star is. Lana Turner was a star, and Ava Gardner, Grace Kelly, Marilyn Monroe, Sid Charisse, and Kay Kendall, all of whom Shannon helped to beautify. We never used hot rollers like the stylists today. We iron curled. But the pinnacle for Peggy, the absolute zenith in stars, was Joan Crawford and Bette Davis. "Joan was the love of my life, a great, great person," said Shannon. "We began together on The Best of Everything at Fox in 1959. We were together on Baby Jane, Sweet Charlotte, and throughout the 1960s. I did her for premieres, the Oscars, and for TV shows. Every Sunday when she was in Hollywood, she had her facials, and I would color her hair. She was very disciplined. The lady took very good care of herself. She had gorgeous skin and very good hair." Bette had fine hair and a different personality. She could be firm, but when Miss Davis wanted to have fun, she was a ball. We pulled a lot of practical jokes on people. She never spoke about Miss Crawford, and I never brought her up. I knew they didn't like each other, that was obvious. Bette said a few things about Joan to the press that weren't true, and maybe Joan spoke about Bette, too. It was none of my business. When reporters would ask, what about their feud, I would say, what feud? I had nothing bad to say about either one. I saw none of that child abuse that Christina wrote about. The people at Paramount called me when they were doing the Mommy Dearest movie. They wanted to see some photographs of hairstyles I had done for Joan. I said, no way. To me, Joan was a walking saint. Bette was wonderful, too. Both of them were very kind, very thoughtful. They made you feel like part of the family. Once, when my back was broken on a movie set, Bette flew into town and insisted that I see her specialist. When I got out of the hospital, she moved in with me to take care of me. Joan was very generous, too. That's the kind of people these two ladies were. So when anyone asks me what they were like, I always say they were the greatest, the best. I was very lucky to know them. A feud? Oh, no. I couldn't ever be bothered with anything like that. Let's just say Joan's not someone I would have any cause to see socially. Or ever did. Bette Davis to McCall's, 1974. On Betty's tour through New Zealand, John Springer was putting together an all-star cast for the movie version of the Broadway musical Follies. The concept was to be changed from the closing of a Broadway theater to that of a Hollywood studio. Set for the leads were Elizabeth Taylor, Henry Fonda, Shirley MacLaine, and Gene Kelly, with a stellar supporting cast to be played by Debbie Reynolds, June Allison, Joan Blondell, and Bette Davis and Joan Crawford. Joan agreed to do the Yvonne DiCarlo part, although her song would have been Broadway Baby, Springer told columnist Liz Smith. Bette Davis was set to sing I'm Still Here, and she was thrilled, even though she had some misgivings about working with Crawford again. All through the trip to Australia and New Zealand, she would play the Follies album, learning the song, and you haven't heard anything until you've heard Bette sing I'm Still Here. The project was set to go at MGM when producer Hal Prince had a falling out with the studio. He felt they were going back on promises, said Springer, and he withdrew the whole project. He was too hurt and bitter to try another studio, and it died. But wouldn't it have been a beauty? Eager to resuscitate her career, in August 1974, Davis opted to return to Broadway as the star of a big-budget musical, Miss Moffat. Based on her original film, The Corn is Green, the role was first offered to Mary Martin. When she declined, the director, Joshua Logan, persuaded Bette to do it. "Thank God for this play," Bette told Logan. "It's going to save me from those flea-bitten films. The last one I read, they had me hanging in a closet." During the rehearsals in New York, Logan, who had experienced that abject lesson in planned frustration when he tried to get Crawford to appear on Broadway in 1953, was now at the mercy of Betty's fears and belligerent defenses. Describing herself as a klutz when it came to intricate dancing, she asked that her choreographed steps be kept to a minimum, and that her singing voice, aged and abused from 40 years of smoking and yelling at her ex-husbands, be limited to performing no more than 3 songs in the show. During the rehearsals, while the rest of us were dancing and singing our little hearts out, Miss Davis preferred to stand by the piano and talk her way through the songs. I don't believe she intended to let anyone hear her sing until we opened in Philadelphia, said one of the other performers. Out of town, faced with an inordinate number of rewrites at rehearsals, the star lashed out repeatedly at the director. She had an aversion to the soft, a loathing for the sentimental, Logan said. It's as though whenever she enters a room, she is compelled to use her favorite silver screen expression, "What a dump." Logan and Emlyn Williams, the writer, were cowards, said Davis's assistant Vic Greenfield. She was scared and getting older, and they didn't know how to handle her. During the preview performances in Philadelphia, Bette began to forget her lines and was inaudible at times. She blamed her lapses on the bad material. "I am too big a star to give a bad performance," she railed at Logan. Then her system cracked, and she entered the hospital with an old back injury. She recovered in time to perform for opening night, but the critics panned her and the play, and after more changes and rewrites, Bette decided to quit. One night I went backstage and I saw her stance in the dressing room. I said, "Oh no, this is it," said Greenfield. She went to bed that night, and the next morning she called me in and said, "I'm not doing it anymore." I said, "Bette, you can't do this. You can't put all these people out of work before Christmas." She looked at me and said, "You're fired." When she lost the use of her legs, Bette entered the hospital again and submitted to tests by the show's insurance doctors. They confirmed that she was indeed paralyzed from the waist down. "Everyone seemed to forget that Mother was one of the most convincing actresses alive," said daughter B.D. "She behaved mischievously," said Joshua Logan, who was threatened with libel when he spoke out against the actress. "How could I damage her career," he asked, "when she's been doing that for 30 years? Joan loved to travel for Pepsi-Cola. Once on tour, she needed a vitamin shot. A doctor was called to the airport. There was nowhere for them to go but the men's room, which was empty. Joan bent over. "Can you imagine," she told me, "if a man had come in and seen my bare ass?" Sheila Graham. In the spring of 1973, although she was finished in movies and television, Crawford was still an active board member of Pepsi-Cola. Her popularity and association with the soft drink company were so established that every day stacks of mail were delivered to the company headquarters addressed to Joan Crawford, president of Pepsi-Cola. She had her own office, press representative, a secretary at home, her limo in New York, and the company jet always at her disposal when she traveled out of town. But that April, the job and the benefits ended abruptly. When she turned 65, she was involuntarily retired by Pepsi. She said she learned the news from the financial pages of the New York Times. She would continue to draw her $50,000 salary as a lifetime pension, but her $40,000 expenses, her car, her New York secretary, and the use of the company jet were discontinued. Because of the cutback in funds, Crawford moved to a smaller apartment in her building, making do with 5 rooms instead of 9. The corner of one room was converted into an office with a table and a typewriter, so the retired star could devote herself to the one remaining task that would occupy her time: the dispatch of the notes and letters to her legion of fans, friends, and new acquaintances. There are probably more signed and framed notes from Joan Crawford in the bathrooms of New York apartments than there are hampers, said reporter Arthur Bell. She always sent out her Christmas cards the day after Thanksgiving, said Sheila Graham. When she received your card, she sent you a thank you note. Yes, those letters were very important to Miss Crawford, said Florence Walsh, her New York secretary, who continued to work part-time for Crawford. They gave her enormous pleasure. It didn't matter if you were famous or not. Everyone who wrote to her always received a reply. She felt that was their due. In September 1974, Crawford agreed to act as a co-hostess with actress Rosalind Russell at a book party for John Springer in New York. Wearing red chiffon, diamonds, and a light brown wig that seemed slightly askew, the star stationed herself at the door of the Rainbow Room in Rockefeller Center. With Rosalind Russell at her side, she personally greeted each guest, including this writer. When my name was given to Joan, she shook my hand, but the tone of her voice was cool. Turning to Rosalind Russell, she said, "This is a good friend of Miss Bette Davis." I waited for the punchline, thinking she was joking. She wasn't. Grasping my hand in introduction, Rosalind Russell smiled warmly. Then, raising one eyebrow, she gave a signal that suggested, "Don't pursue this right now, dear." Since Crawford had already turned to greet other arrivals, I paid my respects to Miss Russell and moved into the room. Crawford was angry because I never wrote up her rebuttal to Betty, I was told. But I never printed Davis's account of their feud either, and later that evening, when I attempted to seek Crawford out to explain, I learned that she had left the party shortly after the last of the guests arrived. She was tired, said John Springer. She was angry, said columnist Jack O'Brien, because her name had been put on the invitations before she agreed to co-hostess. Rosalind Russell had another explanation. Joan is one of the most glamorous creatures God ever put on this earth. But she gets nervous in a crowd, and she was upset because we weren't seated at the same table. The following morning, in her hotel suite, Rosalind Russell looked at the newspaper coverage of the previous night. Her face appeared swollen from the cortisone injections she was taking for crippling arthritis. "Dear God," said Russell to visiting Newsday reporter Jerry Parker, "just look at that picture of those 2 old broads." "Wait until you see the Post," her husband, Frederick Brisson, said. No, don't show it to me," said Russell, shrieking with laughter. "I can't bear it." "You look very vivacious and animated," Brisson said gallantly, "but it's not very flattering of Joan." Crawford, 10 blocks to the north in her own apartment, agreed with Brisson. Staring at the photographs of herself and Russell in the newspapers, she said with finality, "If that's how I look, they won't see me again." That same week, Crawford went through her date book and canceled all public appearances for the remainder of the year. That December, she had been scheduled to receive a special award at the Pepsi convention in San Francisco. A short time before, she called Mitchell Cox, their PR chief, and refused to attend. "I worked my ass off for the company for almost 20 years, and now they have washed me up. Well, screw 'em, I'm not going," said the star. Jack O'Brien reported another reason for the Pepsi cancellation. Joan had fallen down and blackened her beautiful eye, he said in his column. "Have you looked in the mirror lately? You're a drunk, Mother. Nothing but a broken-down drunk." B.D. Hyman, My Mother's Keeper. Alcohol preyed on Mother's mind, distorting reality, causing her to blame others for her mistakes and personal weaknesses. It also preyed on her own ego, eating away at her self-respect and good looks. Christina Crawford, Mommy Dearest. During the same period of time, according to their daughters, Bette Davis and Joan Crawford became reclusive alcoholics. After the closing of Miss Moffat and the insurance claims were settled, Davis regained the use of her legs and returned to Connecticut, where she remained in semi-seclusion for the next 10 months. Crawford, according to Christina, also began to live a progressively more solitary life, without seeing many people, but Carl Johns, a frequent visitor, said the perception of the star being a recluse in her ivory tower was just a load of horseshit. She had a problem about going out, he recalled, because Joan always wanted to be the movie star. Still, she entertained all the time with lots of people around. But Christina was never there. In her book, she said they had reconciled, but they hadn't. In 1974, I brought up Christina's name, and Joan said, "I hear she's found a new home. I hope she's very happy. All she and Christopher ever wanted was my money." And I said, "Gee, that's awfully hard. Can't you do something about that?" And she said, "Yes, I can. I can cut them out of my will." Alana Nash, who also visited and spoke to Crawford frequently, recalled the same interdict. "I had been warned never to bring up the name of Christina or Christopher. I never heard of any reconciliation between them. Later, when Dearest came out, I interviewed Christina for the Louisville Courier, and I asked her about that. She became evasive, and at the end of our conversation, she said she would appreciate it if I didn't mention it in my story." Nash said she could understand the breach between mother and daughter after she experienced some icy behavior from the star. Describing her visits to Joan as electrifying, terrifying, unnerving, and even demeaning, the writer said she never understood why Crawford pursued a friendship with her. "I would go to her house and she would greet me with polite tolerance. She usually had other people there so she could ignore me. If I attempted to make conversation with her, she would cut me off with a sarcastic retort." Looking for a reason for the star's hostile behavior, Nash wondered if it was because she was female and younger, or because she had been an honors student at Stevens College where Joan had once failed. Billy Casson still existed within Joan Crawford, the author believed, and perhaps I was her chance to get back at those other girls who shamed her into running away from school so long ago. I didn't know. But I found my visits with her demeaning and painful. Once she invited me to dinner, then insisted I eat alone while she played backgammon with her friend Mary Jane Raphael. I wasn't halfway through my meal when she asked me what time my first class was in the morning. On the way home that night, sharing a cab with Mary Jane, I told her I felt so humiliated that I didn't intend to visit Crawford again. "You've got to go back," she said. "Joan is awfully fond of you. She thinks you're very bright. And besides, she's terribly lonely." Carl Johns also stated that his friendship with Crawford wasn't always easy. "She wasn't sweet and perfect all the time, which was fine with me because I've never been attracted to wimps either. She could be great fun and very frank. Once she told me that she and actor John Ireland made 2 movies together. During their love scenes, he would always get a huge erection. 'Now, John,' she would caution him, 'we can't have that in our close-ups.' It was as if she wanted me to know that in her day she was a very hot number," Johns continued. "And Bette Davis wasn't. Joan was very specific about that. 'You see, Betty is disappointed in life,' Joan would say, 'and that's why, if you look at her mouth carefully, darling, you'll see that over the years it has turned down.'" There were frequent nights when Crawford could be found at home, alone, drinking and talking back to her television set. When her old movies were shown, if the movie was real bad, she would yell at the TV and say, "Joan Crawford, you stink! You really stink!" If the film was good, she cut telephone callers short. "Hang up," she told her daughter Cindy. "I'm watching Flamingo Road and it's enchanting." Joan also kept track of Bette Davis's exposure on TV. "The night Betty appeared on Dick Cavett's show, Joan called me," said Alana Nash. "I asked if she watched the show. 'Yes,' said Joan, 'and Cavett made a fool out of himself.' It was as if she was actually defending Davis. She thought Cavett's questions were silly and not worthy of Betty." Illustrator Tim Scott recalled similar signals from Joan. "She would call me early in the morning at work and she'd say, 'Watch Channel 9 tonight. Special Agent with Bette Davis is on at 11. It's a real stinker. You'll love it.'" When Betty's cult classic All About Eve was shown, Joan took the phone off the hook. "She must have seen it 10 times, said Scott. "She told me she always watched it because of the script and the director, Joe Mankiewicz." "She never told me she liked it," said Mankiewicz.
In Connecticut, Bette Davis could also be found parked in front of a TV set watching a parade of images. In the afternoon, according to Vic Greenfield, she watched soap operas and the occasional Joan Crawford movie. "Christ, that dame had a face," Bette would say in baleful tribute. "She admired Joan up to a point," said Greenfield. "She always said she was a professional, and Bette also recognized that Joan was a star." The possibility of the two aging actresses burying the hatchet and becoming friends at this time was remote. "Mother felt they had nothing in common," said B.D. "And at that time she couldn't be friends with herself. She was full of self-pity and hatred." "She's antagonized every fucking person she's come in contact with," said Gary Merrill. "She had no friends left because nobody would put up with her." High on vodka, demanding, neurotic, and imperious, Lawrence Quirk described Joan Crawford, calling him at 3 and 4 o'clock in the morning. "I felt for her loneliness and unhappiness, but she was just too much." "It was a period of sheer terror for Joan," said George Cukor, who was also on the receiving end of late-night calls from the Star. "One night she would call and say she was so happy to be out of the business, that this was the first time in her life she was free from the pressures and the stress. And why wasn't I living in New York? How could I stand living in Hollywood?" 2 nights later, she would call again, begging me to reassure her that she would work again. She needed what we all needed, another job, another movie, the chance to create, to keep busy, to stop thinking of ourselves and what we had in the past. According to her agent, Stan Kamen, there were jobs for Crawford during this period, but she had lost her self-confidence. Joan's career and life had been built on 2 things, her looks and her glamour. When her looks began to go, the foundation crumbled. If she couldn't retain the image of the movie star she cherished, she didn't want to work anymore. She called one day and told us not to bother submitting her name for parts anymore. Today, after more than a quarter of a century of being all roles to all fans, Joan Crawford doesn't know who she is, columnist Sidney Skolsky reported in 1975. Bette Davis also had vanity, but her foundation was her acting talent. Tougher and more resilient, as long as she could walk and talk, she felt she was eligible for work. In June 1975, with bills to pay, she stopped drinking and went to Seattle to appear in a minor role in a horror film entitled Burnt Offerings. On location, the legendary matriarch displayed little affection for her co-stars, Oliver Reed and Karen Black. Reed got drunk one night and fell down a mountainside while playing the bagpipes, she told Rex Reed. And Karen Black changes her makeup in the middle of a scene so nothing matches on the screen. She sleeps all day, never goes to rushes, and you can't hear a bloody thing she says on the set. When I made movies, you could hear me in a tunnel. The next year, Davis played the mother of Faye Dunaway in the TV film The Disappearance of Amy. Dunaway, who would later play Joan Crawford in Mommy Dearest, was, according to Joan, the only actress in the 1970s crop who has the talent and the class and the courage to become a real star. Naturally, Bette Davis disagreed. While filming in Utah during the summer heat wave, Bette censured Faye for riding around town all night in a chauffeur-driven limousine, sipping champagne in the back seat, then holding up production the next day. "Compared to Miss Dunaway, Joan Crawford was a real pro," she observed. "The biggest disaster in my years in the business," Betty's hairdresser Peggy Shannon concurred. She was on the set the afternoon the dynamic but tandy Miss Dunaway made 1,500 people stand around in 110-degree heat. The girl was so stoned, all she did was read cue cards, which her makeup man held down in front of her. The director got so mad he threw a bottle of Coke at her. It hit the floor and splattered all over her white dress. I was standing stage right, and walking toward me, she said, "Get the hell out of my way!" I stood there and let her walk around me. Later, thinking that Miss Davis had returned to the big double dressing room, I went in. Dunaway was sitting there alone with her hairdresser doing her hair. When she saw me enter, she jumped out of her chair and put her face in front of mine. "When I tell you to move, goddammit, you move," she said. "I have work to do," I replied. She said, "I haven't seen you do work on the set." "No," I said, "because my work is so perfect, I don't have to change a thing." Her hairdresser then grabbed her, and I swear I had to run like hell because she was going to belt me. I absolutely will not allow anyone to call me grandmother. They can call me Auntie Joan, Dee Dee, Cho-Cho, anything but grandmother. It pushes a woman almost into the grave. Joan Crawford. In 1975, Joan Crawford renewed her faith in Christian Science and gave up drinking. "We were all amazed," said daughter Christina. "She had been drinking since I was a baby." "She lost weight and began to relax," said Tim Scott. "She even developed a sense of humor about herself. I remember I called her up one morning and invited her to the opening of the New York Film Festival. She seemed pleased by the invitation. 'But Tim, dear,' she asked, 'who do you want to go with, me or Joan Crawford?' I said, 'What's the difference?' 30 days, she said. That's how long it would take to varnish the face and make her presentable." Kathleen Carroll, the film critic for the New York Daily News, was at home one Sunday evening when her phone rang. "Kathleen?" the husky voice inquired. "This is Joan Crawford." "Yes, Miss Crawford," said Carroll, a little nervous. "Call me Joan," the star commanded. "Yes, Miss Crawford," said Kathleen. Crawford proceeded to invite the critic and her predecessor, Wanda Hale, to her home for drinks the following Wednesday night. "Naturally we accepted," said Kathleen, who was excited at the prospect of seeing the star in her own home. Wanda and I arrived promptly on the appointed evening. The door to her apartment opened, and there stood this elderly woman in a house dress and rubber-thonged flip-flops. It was Joan, looking as if she had just stepped out of the shower. Her hair was pulled back, and she wasn't wearing any makeup, just a little lipstick, which made her look surprisingly young, but not like the Joan Crawford we knew. Miss Hale and I were taken by surprise. We thought we had the wrong date, but Joan said, "Come in, I've been expecting you." She showed us her apartment. Then we sat down in the living room. Drinks were served in plastic glasses, but Joan didn't have a drink. She told us she had not taken hard liquor in 9 weeks. She pulled her house dress around her waist to show off her girlish figure. Apparently she had made a deliberate decision not to dress up for us, but she gave no excuses or an explanation. We figured she just couldn't be bothered with the glamour anymore. The visit lasted about an hour. Joan talked about Hollywood, how she seldom went out there anymore, and when she did, she never left her hotel. "All my friends are out of work," she said. "It's so sad, they never leave their house." She could have been speaking about herself or Bette Davis, but no names were mentioned, and she preferred to give the impression that she didn't really care. And then she disappeared into the kitchen and came out with some frozen quiche, which she served on paper plates. I never got to eat mine because her little dog jumped up on my lap and finished it off. We spoke some more, and then it was time to leave. Saying goodbye, she seemed bravely self-sufficient. Wanda and I felt so sad that we headed straight to a restaurant and had a few stiff drinks. It hurt us to see someone we had admired for so long be so desperately lonely. I have never been so content in my life. I think one had to earn that in life, contentment, and it's a beautiful feeling. Joan Crawford to Alana Nash, September 21st, 1976. A last call from Joan. In December 1976, while researching a story about cinematography, I wrote Miss Crawford a letter. In a career spanning 5 decades, she had worked with some of the leading cameramen, including George Folsey, Robert Plank, and Ernest Haller. In the letter, I mentioned the story and wondered if she would care to talk about these craftsmen. I delivered the note to the doorman of her building. The doorman said that Miss Crawford was in residence, but not seeing anyone. 2 days passed, and on the morning of the 3rd day, Crawford called. She was enthusiastic about the article I was doing. "It's about time someone wrote about our wonderful cameramen," she said. "They are the real magicians of this business, and they are so seldom mentioned in reviews or articles." Her voice was soft, and she spoke very slow. I asked if she wanted to set up an appointment to talk at a later time. "Can we do it now?" she said. "My mind is clear, and I have business meetings all week." Speaking of her early days at MGM, she said she knew nothing about the camera. "It was there. I was told not to look into it. In time, I grew less awkward, but my primary concern was that I looked good. My nose always seemed to be too big, and I hated my mouth. I seldom smiled because there was a space between my teeth. It was slight, but on the screen I thought it looked enormous. I was vain and silly. like any young actress who thinks that the entire world is looking only at her.
During the 1930s, she said, it was cameraman Oliver Marsh, Possessed, and William Daniels, Grand Hotel, who taught her about camera lighting and how the close-up lens could catch her slightest emotion.
I was constantly told not to give so much, especially with my eyes and features. I listened, and I learned. Some early critic once said something to the effect that Joan Crawford was an effective actress, but only in front of the camera. That upset and confused me. Movies are made by cameras. Where else should I project? Into the scenery? Down to the floor? Yes, it seems funny today, but back then, I was a very serious young girl about my work.
Crawford proceeded to talk about the differences between working at MGM and Warner's. At her old studio, they would spend hours lighting the sets and the stars, whereas at Warner's the emphasis was on time and cost.
It was the war. Film was scarce. They had to do so many setups within a work period. If they missed too many, Jack Warner would call down to the set.
She spoke about Ernest Haller and his work on Mildred Pierce, and on Humoresque, when the leading star of the studio, Bette Davis, stole the cameraman's services. On her last film with Haller, Whatever Happened to Baby Jane, Crawford said she couldn't recall any specifics on the camera work because the shooting schedule was so tight.
One of the few scenes of mine that required an elaborate setup was the one where I found the dead rat on my luncheon tray. It wasn't enough that I screamed. Mr. Aldrich needed action with my reaction. I couldn't run from the room because I was playing a cripple. It was Ernie's idea to shoot me from overhead, circling in a frenzy in the wheelchair. He used 2 cameras. One was placed at waist level in the doorway. The second camera was 10 feet above my head in the crosswalks. When they yelled action, I was to scream and spin myself around and around in the wheelchair. We did so many takes that my arms were ready to drop off from pushing myself in the chair. It was very hard work. I remember later at the beach, Miss Davis was supposed to wheel me from the car to the water's edge, but she couldn't push the chair in the sand. You can see how tough it was on my arms, I told her, and she agreed.
During this part of the conversation, there was no animosity in Crawford's voice when she mentioned Davis's name. She gave the impression that Bette was just another actress she had worked with until, unprompted, she began to talk about seeing a final cut of Baby Jane in California in October 1962.
I attended a screening at Warner's, and I became totally immersed in the movie. I thought it was a powerful film. Everyone, Ernie Haller, Bob Aldrich, did a marvelous job. And Bette Davis was superb as Jane. I sent her flowers and champagne that evening. She never acknowledged the gesture or even bothered to call the next day when she saw the movie.
This was in 1962?
Yes, said Joan, in October of 1962, 2 weeks before the picture was released.
But according to Davis, she never saw the completed film until the following year, at the Cannes Film Festival in May 1963.
That's a lie, said Crawford. She saw the picture, fully edited, the day after I saw it. It was complete except for part of the credits, and one short scene with Jane as a young girl which was being redubbed. The rest of the picture was there. I saw it with Mr. Aldrich at Warner Brothers. Bette was to have joined us for the screening, but she never showed up. Despite some initial misgivings about the way I looked, I thought Bob did a terrific job, and Bette was magnificent. That afternoon I sent her the flowers and champagne, and later that night I called her at home. "You were wonderful, darling," I told her. "I heard," she said. She told me she had no intention of seeing the film. "But you must," I urged her. "After all, we were supposed to go out to tour together, to promote the film. How could she talk about a picture that she hadn't seen?" "You've got a point," she said. So the next afternoon, Bob Aldrich set up another screening for her. I waited all that evening and that night to hear from her. She never called. The next morning I called her. "Well, Bette, what did you think?" Joan asked her co-star. There was a pause, then Bette answered, "You were so right, Joan. The picture is good, and I was terrific." "That was it," said Joan. She never said anything about my performance. Not a word.
Not once in her entire career, it seemed, had the great actress Bette Davis ever acknowledged that her rival Joan Crawford had any talent. And presumably it was that last denial of approval that led Crawford to cancel the Baby Jane publicity tour with Davis, and to upstage her in another round of competitive tit-for-tat at the Oscars the following year. But before I was allowed to harbor a thought that a star of Crawford's stature would hold a grudge or stoop to acts of petty malice, Joan rushed in with a tactful and concluding assessment of her trials with Bette. Of course, that was a long, long time ago, and I've forgotten most of the unpleasantness. Certainly I continue to admire Miss Davis. She is one of our finest dramatic actresses. Her movies will remain beacons of achievements forever. In January 1977, it was reported that Crawford was getting ready to return to movies. "She has found a script she likes and is coming out here for story conferences," said Hollywood publicist Joe Hennig. There was also a report in Variety that the star was set for a TV series entitled The Silver Fox. That same month, actress Mamie Van Doren said that Crawford had the hotel room next to her at the Ambassador East Hotel in Chicago. "She was seldom seen outside her room," said Van Doren, "but I could hear her up at all hours of the night watching television and moving about like a phantom." According to Crawford's secretary, the actress never left New York in 1977. She couldn't work or travel because she was dying of stomach cancer. Carl Johns had visited the ailing star the previous December. "She still talked of working, but it was obvious something was very wrong. She looked as if she was disintegrating right in front of me. 'I'm getting down to picture weight, darling,' she said, but I didn't buy that." Bette rises again. By an ironic twist of fate, during the last few months of Joan Crawford's life, Bette Davis resurrected her life and career. She left Connecticut and bought a condominium apartment in Los Angeles, because let's face it, this is where the industry is. In January 1977, she traveled to Washington to attend the inauguration of Jimmy Carter and took a poke in the press at the president's mother. "Miss Lillian doesn't like any women," said Bette. "She was perfectly terrible to all of us at the inauguration. She only wanted to see the men. When any woman came up to her, she just glared at us like this," and at Elizabeth Taylor, who declined to have Davis as a co-star in the film of A Little Night Music. "She is such a fool," said Davis. "One would think that after all her years in the business, she would want to work with a professional." That month, it was also announced that Bette Davis would be the first woman to receive the Lifetime Achievement Award from the American Film Institute in Los Angeles. The attendant press leading up to the March event was plentiful, and most of it was seen by the ailing Joan Crawford. Interviews with Bette appeared in the New York Times, the Los Angeles Times, Time, People, and Women's Wear Daily. "She is another DiMaggio, another Einstein, the best there is," said Robert Aldrich, not mentioning his other Baby Jane star, Crawford. "I am thrilled to be back in Hollywood," Bette told the Los Angeles Times, and mentioned that at long last she would be making Ethan Frome with Henry Fonda as Caleb and Liv Ullmann in the role that rival Joan had once coveted. In New York, as the AFI event approached, Bette Davis retrospectives were held at revival houses and on television. "I am happy for Bette," Crawford was quoted as saying. "She deserves this most prestigious honor." Director Vincent Sherman recalled a different reaction from Joan. Having directed Bette in Old Acquaintance and Mr. Skeffington, Sherman was asked to attend and to speak at the AFI tribute to Davis. He considered declining because she had recently been particularly nasty and vicious toward an old friend and colleague of mine, Irving Rapper. "It was gratuitous cruelty," said Rapper. "Bette kept giving these interviews saying I was not responsible for any of her good moments in Now Voyager. She claimed that her most famous scene, the one with the 2 cigarettes, was thought up by her and Paul Henreid, when in actuality it came from a 1923 movie with Ruth Chatterton." "I was writing to Joan," Sherman continued, "and I told her I had doubts about going to the AFI tribute for Davis. A few days passed, and I had a call from Betty Barker, her secretary. She asked if I would be at home to take a call from Joan. I said, of course. Joan called and said, 'Darling, don't go to the Davis dinner. She's really not worth the trouble.' I didn't go," said Sherman. And Crawford didn't watch the ceremony, she said, when it was shown on television in late March.
If you've earned a position, be proud of it. Don't hide it. I want to be recognized. When I hear people say, "There's Joan Crawford," I turn around and say, "Hi, how are you?" Joan Crawford, My Way of Life.
This upload is made by the concluding chapter of Crawford.
Up until the last week of her life, the 73-year-old legend did not expect to die. Her faith in Christian Science made her believe that her body would cure itself of the pancreatic cancer that had spread through her system. As the pain increased and her weight kept dropping, she asked Mrs. Markham, her Christian Science practitioner, if she was dying. With God, the spirit was eternal, she was told, and Crawford accepted that. She didn't complain or tell anyone, not even her children, that she had cancer, because that was how stars behaved, and Joan Crawford was one of the first order. "I am so at peace with the world that I'm even thinking good thoughts about Bette Davis," Crawford wrote on one of her Christmas cards that last season. To special friends, she sent a recent photograph taken by John Angsted. The false eyelashes were in place, the famous mouth was painted, and her posture was erect as she held her beloved dog, Princess, in her lap. But her hair was turning white, and her face was taut with pain. "She knew she didn't look good," said Vincent Sherman. "She sent me a note with the photograph. It read, 'Darling, if you don't like the picture, please throw it away. I'll understand.'" Early in May, as her weight dropped to 90 pounds, Crawford could no longer lift her small dog, and she gave it away. "She called me that same week," said Monty Westmore. "Her voice was very weak. She spoke very slow, and it wasn't her usual bright and cheery self. When she mentioned she was giving the dog away, I knew something had to be drastic. I tried to get Peggy Shannon and Joan's friend Vivian Walker to find out what was wrong. None of us knew she was dying." On Tuesday morning, May 10th, the ailing star insisted on getting out of bed to make breakfast for her housekeeper and a fan who had stayed over. While they were eating the meal, Crawford returned to her bedroom and died. At noon, the medical examiner was already there when her secretary, Florence Walsh, arrived for work. "She died of a heart attack," said Walsh. "It was cancer," said Betty Barker, her longtime secretary in California. "That's what the lawyer told us." "I never bought that story," said Debbie Reynolds, who was one of several people who believed that Crawford committed suicide. "There were too many coincidental events leading up to it," Reynolds believed. "I just feel Joan found some way to exit this life before she looked too bad, before she had to suffer the ravages of decay anymore." "Suicide wasn't her style," said Harry Mines, who had just picked up his mail that morning when he heard the news over the radio. "I stood there with a letter from Joan in my hand. It was a terrible shock because I had no warning." Bette Davis was on a movie set when she learned of the death of Joan Crawford. "We were at Disney Studios working on Witch Mountain," said Peggy Shannon. "I was doing her hair at the time in the makeup van when Joan's secretary, Florence, called me from New York. She had made arrangements for me to fly to New York to attend the funeral services. I thought it so strange. Joan was gone, and here I was working on Betty. I am sure she would have given me the time off, but I didn't ask, and she said nothing." "Bette Davis is more evasive on the subject of Joan Crawford than Richard Nixon is with David Frost," said reporter Arthur Bell when he covered the services that Friday at Campbell's Funeral Chapel in New York. "It was a mob scene outside with the fans and celebrities swapping tears and autographs," said Bell. "Myrna Loy was there, and Van Johnson, and Joan's daughter Christina, who nobody recognized or seemed to care about. When Andy Warhol arrived with his flock and his Polaroid camera, he came over to me and said, 'Arthur, is Bette Davis here?' I said, 'Hardly.' That evening I called Betty's press agent to get a quote from my column, but I was told she wasn't talking to anyone. That was understandable. What could she say? The bitch is dead? Long live the bitch?" "The memorial service in Hollywood was beautiful," said Peggy Shannon. "Each branch of the union was represented," Harry Mines recalled. "We read telegrams from every director and star she ever worked with," said George Cukor. "But there wasn't a word from Bette Davis." A year would pass before Davis would offer a comment on the death of her most faithful and formidable rival. The occasion was the Academy Awards ceremonies in Hollywood, which featured a special tribute to the stars who had died the previous year. As Sammy Davis Jr. sang "Come Light the Candles," Betty was backstage watching the tribute on television, in a dressing room with Greer Garson, Barbara Stanwyck, and Olivia de Havilland. As the song was ending and photographs of the deceased, Charles Chaplin, Groucho Marx, Bing Crosby, and Elvis Presley, appeared on the TV monitors, Betty stood up and prepared for her appearance as a presenter. Suddenly, the sound of a tumultuous ovation filled the entire auditorium. Appearing on the giant screen and monitors was the luminous face of the ultimate movie star, Joan Crawford. Looking up at the wide, lustrous eyes of Crawford, Bette Davis paused, nodded, then, clipping each syllable, bestowed a final benediction on her long-time rival. "Poor Joan," said Betty. "Gone, but not forgotten. Bless you." And then she exited the room to seize the stage for her own appearance. 22. "I'm the nicest goddamn dame who ever lived." Bette Davis to Rex Reed. There was never a feud between them, Betty stated repeatedly in the years that followed her rival's demise. In London, when reporter Nancy Mills asked about the enemies she had made in the motion picture business, Davis replied, "Enemies? I have no enemies. Who?" "Joan Crawford," said the brave Miss Mills. In a tone of sugared innocence, Betty replied, "Miss Crawford and I weren't enemies. We made one film together. We didn't know each other at all." "Most of her rivals are now dead," said the reporter, "and Miss Davis would like to present herself as just another little old lady in tennis shoes." The myth and legend of Joan Crawford were also magnified after her death. In 1978, her personal effects, hats, sheets, monogrammed pillowcases, were auctioned off at Sotheby's and Christie's in New York. Appraised at $8,000, the small cache of Crawford memorabilia brought in $42,850. Among the bidders was Andy Warhol, who purchased several pairs of Crawford's false eyelashes and pieces of her costume jewelry, which the pop artist would wear under his suits and ties when he ventured forth on his own peripatetic rounds of self-promotion. The camp element of the auction was a source of shame to Crawford's daughter Christina, who said she was embarrassed by my association with her. Christina, of course, did not share in the proceeds of the sale or in her mother's will. But in November 1978, she remembered Mama with the release of her book, Mommy Dearest. "It's a love story, a very sad love story," said the authoress. "Tina cared about that bitch. She still cares," said the other disinherited member of Crawford's family, her son Christopher. He recalled a meeting in Florida in 1962, when he had brought his newborn daughter to see her famous grandmother. "Joan Crawford summoned me to her suite at the Fontainebleau Hotel. She took one look at my child and said, 'It doesn't look like you. It's probably a bastard.' I walked out. It was the last time I saw her." "She was tough on us, sure," said daughter Kathy in her mother's defense. "You'd get a swat once in a while, but none of that physical beatings, the coat hangers. I think Christina must have been in another household." Her sister Cindy recalled the time she was attending Dubuque University and had a romance with a student. She became pregnant and told Joan, who at first offered to arrange for an abortion. "But I wanted the kid, and Mother gave her full approval." "I think Christina was jealous," Cindy believed. "She wanted to be the one person she couldn't be, Mother. I think she'll use Joan until she can't get any more out of it. Then she'll dump her." With Mommy Dearest selling 10,000 copies a day, some of Crawford's Hollywood friends and co-stars came forward to protect the memory of the star they knew. "It's lies, all lies," said Van Johnson. "No one I know ever saw any child abuse," said Mildred Pierce's daughter Ann Blythe. When Paramount Pictures bought the film rights to the book, Marlene Dietrich wrote an angry letter to one of their executives. "I am shocked that Paramount bought that filthy book and made the frightful bitch who wrote it rich, and that rhymes," said Marlene. "I did not know Joan Crawford, but nobody deserves that kind of slaughter. Too bad she did not leave her where she found her, so she could now spit her poison in the slums of some big city. I hate her with a passion, and I know the public will." Bette Davis bought an early copy of Mommy Dearest, then called her daughter. "I am reading the most horrific book. You must read it," she told BD. "I read that book in a state of shock," Betty confessed to Elliot Sirkin of the Detroit News. It didn't make me feel the least bit sorry for Joan. She was clearly not disciplined personally, and her problem was obvious: drink. The book makes her a monster, but one gets the feeling Christina couldn't have made it up, could she? Bette told the New York Times. In Playboy, she stated that Christina had every right to publish the book. I don't blame the daughter, don't blame her at all. She was left without a cent, living in a motor home in Tarzana. One area of life Joan should never have gone into was children. Mother Bette. While endorsing the merits of Mommy Dearest, Bette Davis frequently told the press that her children would never write a book about her. "Boy, you could really do a number on me. But you won't, will you, dear?" she warned her daughter BD. But in 1985, Davis was awarded the same filial dishonor as her rival, when the personal accounts of her drinking and domestic tirades were put on public display in My Mother's Keeper. This was the latest in a series of dire misfortunes for the aging star. She had just undergone a mastectomy. My God, I always thought cancer would never dare come near me. And suffered a stroke. I was furious, she said. I did not think I deserved it. Of all the human afflictions, a stroke is about the worst. I wouldn't wish it on Adolf Hitler. And then the book by B.D. Hyman was released. Scathing, said the Philadelphia Inquirer. So moving, said the New York Times. So what? Said Ed Baker of the Seattle Times. Aren't there a few other imperfect mothers in the world? Epic characters have epic torments, said Neil O'Hara in Christopher Street. And Christina Crawford, as leaden as her little heart may be, at least made a decent stab at the epic. Christina knew she was dealing with a mythic figure whom she did not purport to understand. B.D., on the other hand, is heavy into amateur psychology. I know what she would have deserved. Joan for a mother. That would have given her something to write about. Bette and Helen and Lillian. Davis survived the cancer, the stroke, and the book, and in the persistent pursuit of her art went on to demolish a few other living legends. Her 1983 co-star in an Agatha Christie TV movie was Helen Hayes. She and Miss Hayes had met a few times before, once at a party in Betty's New York townhouse. When daughter B.D. referred to Miss Hayes as the leading actress of the stage, Bette replied, "First lady of the theater, my ass. I'm the first lady." When I heard Miss Hayes was going to work with Mother on the Agatha Christie movie, my heart went out to her, said B.D. She was a dear, sweet lady. I felt she didn't deserve this. On the first day of filming, Davis started by snapping at me, Miss Hayes told Pat O'Hare of the New York Daily News. I said good morning, and she looked right through me. Later, when the cast gathered for introductions, our eyes met, and I waved. What's that mean? Bette snapped. I was saying good morning, I answered. You already did that, she snapped back. I was never so scared in my life, and I was in the war, said another actor on the film, John Mills. Miss Lillian Gish did not glow in the warmth of Betty's embrace either. When the two seasoned stars met at the National Board of Review Awards in 1984, Miss Gish went on stage and made a lovely but lengthy speech about D.W. Griffith. Bette was sitting in the front row, and she became annoyed because Lillian was talking too much, said a New York writer. As Miss Gish went on, Bette began to mutter out loud, "The silly bitch, get her off, get her off!" In Maine, 2 years later, on the first day of shooting for The Whales of August, Miss Gish went over to Bette and welcomed her. If you want to talk about the work or the script, Bette growled at the frail Lillian, fine. Otherwise we have nothing to talk about. On the set another day, it was reported that when director Lindsay Anderson complimented Lillian Gish on a lovely close-up, Bette barked from the sidelines, "Of course it's a lovely close-up! The bitch invented close-ups!" She made mincemeat out of poor Lillian, said Helen Hayes. Lillian swears she'll never act again. So first she drove me from the screen, now she's driven Lillian. She's making a clean sweep of everyone our age. The Main Contender. In 1987, 10 years after her death, it was Joan Crawford who remained as the #1 nemesis of Bette Davis. That spring, Betty's second set of memoirs, This and That, became a bestseller.
The book was anticipated as a blistering retort to her disloyal daughter, but she was mentioned only in the afterword, in a letter euphemistically addressed to Dear Hymen. She couldn't very well call her Dear C blank blank T, could she? Asked one irreverent scribe. The afterword took up 2 short pages, while another, older, more formidable foe, Joan Crawford, received an entire chapter. Did Bette Davis and Joan Crawford feud during the filming of Baby Jane? No, said the author star, answering her own question. With that settled, the magnificently virulent Betty marched on, blithely disclosing that Joan was a skilled sexual politician who drank too much vodka on the job, wore 3 sets of falsies at different times, and was in general a silly, vain old fool who stole the Oscar that rightfully belonged to Davis. That November, Miss Davis agreed to talk for this book, devoted entirely to her and Miss Crawford. Again, she said there was no feud, and she had nothing further to say about her rival. She then proceeded to talk about Aries women, Joan's background, her unrequited crush on Joan's second husband, Francho Tone, the making of Baby Jane, and other Crawford-related topics, the quotes of which are in those particular chapters. At the end of our conversation, Davis declared it was fascinating that the public still linked her name with Crawford. I have never been anywhere, all over the world, they haven't asked about Joan and me. I don't mind it. I find it interesting. But I have always wondered, what do people think they see in us together? After all, we had nothing in common. 23. Indestructible. That's the word that's often used to describe me. I suppose it means that I just overcame everything. But without things to overcome, you don't become much of a person, do you? Bette Davis. In 1988, when the original edition of this book was near completion, Bette Davis was very much alive, emotionally and intellectually, though her physical health was not as robust as her tumultuous will desired. At age 80, the after-effects of the stroke had left one side of her face paralyzed, and her legendary stride was impeded by a limp. That, however, did not curb the most important force in her life, the work, the zest to find, then lose herself in the next great role, which in turn would provide her with her next glorious honor. I wanted to be the first to win 3 Oscars, she said, but Miss Hepburn has done it. Actually, it hasn't been done. Miss Hepburn only won half an Oscar. If they'd given me half an Oscar, I would have thrown it back in their faces. You see, I'm an Aries. I never lose. In our conversation the previous November, Davis revealed that she had found her next perfect character, that of the aging, cantankerous Southern woman in Driving Miss Daisy. She had read the finished script, and though other established stars, including Katharine Hepburn and Angela Lansbury, were vying for the part, Miss Davis decided she should have it. Because the producer was Richard Zanuck, and she had rescued his father, mogul Darryl Zanuck, from a critical situation during the early 1950s. He was desperate for someone to replace Claudette Colbert in All About Eve, she said, and I did him a huge favor by taking over the role of Margot Channing. That bountiful gift aside, it was payback time, Davis decided. She called Zanuck Jr. and requested a meeting. She also contacted Steve Ross, the CEO of Warner Brothers, who were financing and distributing the film from the huge revenue they were receiving from the sale of her classic films on home video, Davis believed. Memorizing the script, she practiced key scenes, using the brisk Southern cadences mastered for her previous Oscar-winning role in Jezebel. And then she waited. Waited. But alas, was given no opportunity to perform for the producers. The role of Miss Daisy went to Jessica Tandy, 1 year younger. Tandy also got the Oscar, and Robbie Lance, Betty's longtime agent in New York, got the shaft. When he heard Davis was talking to other representatives in Hollywood, he wrote her a lovely note suggesting they part professionally but keep their enduring friendship intact. Betty never responded, choosing instead to put her signature on an exclusive pact with the ICM agency in Los Angeles. The last film. At the same time the young Turks at ICM were looking for suitable projects for their senior star, Betty was busy, beating the literary bushes on her own. A script arrived created exclusively for her by Larry Cohen. He had written independent, non-cult films such as Women of San Quentin and It's Alive 3, an original story about mutant babies. His tailored offering for Bette was a black comedy, the story of an elderly witch who marries an older man and proceeds to wreak metaphysical havoc on his stepchildren. Bette, who adored ghoulish props, remember the dead parakeet and rat in Baby Jane, was delighted with those created for her in The Wicked Stepmother. When her stepdaughter starts to wither under the stress and wishes her stepmom were as kind and beautiful as her dead mother, the camera pans to a framed photograph of Joan Crawford. But not the one from Betty's private scrapbook, which had Joan's front teeth blacked out. Her fee of $250,000 was agreed to, and Betty's live-in companion, Catherine Cermak, was hired as a co-producer, a good investment as she would be the production liaison and ensure that her boss got to work on time. Taking care of the star's interests, however, soon stretched the budget of the modest independent film. Bette had to be consulted on everything from the camera angles to her wardrobe, no expense spared. She insisted that her clothes be fitted and made by Western Costume, who outfitted her for All About Eve. Her red wigs were also custom-made, but the cost to the producers was cut substantially when Davis called the manufacturers and told them that she was wearing the wigs, so they better be perfect and be provided wholesale. Her makeup was also custom-blended, and her false eyelashes purchased in bulk. There again, money would eventually be saved because during filming, no one was allowed to touch the star's face. Final makeup credit? Bette Davis. Filming began on April 25, 1988. In advance, everyone was told not to treat Miss Davis as old. She was not to be helped or catered to. If she forgot a line or walked out of the camera range, she or the director would be the ones to correct this, not the script girl or cameraman. On the way to the set, when she fell and couldn't get up, rather than embarrass or anger her, the crew were told to walk around her. With time, Bette grew accustomed to the pace and was proud to be part of an independent unit. Then problems developed. The sound man had trouble when her dialogue became garbled due to a broken dental bridge in her mouth. For the scene where she was to show her quintessential artistry with a cigarette, she whipped one out and placed it in her mouth, whereupon her character's witch-like power was supposed to light it automatically. But the prop man goofed. Too much air was propelled into the cigarette, and the flames scorched Betty's nostrils. Paranoia and insecurity crept in after that. Fearing that it was she who was being used as the ultimate prop to bolster and strengthen an inferior script, Davis asked that the filmed footage be screened for her. She was horrified by what she saw. Akin to Joan Crawford's situation on Hush, Hush, Sweet Charlotte, she knew the only way she could save her sanity and stature was by ditching the picture. That weekend, she called the director and told him she was ill and would not be returning to complete the film. Similar to Joan, she believed the entire production would now be disbanded. And even if they recast her part, her filmed scenes were limited and would never be shown. She was wrong. The 15 minutes of her footage were edited into the revamped film, which was then released with her name above the title. And though she went on Entertainment Tonight to denounce this, The Wicked Stepmother would be forever known as Bette Davis's last movie. The role Bette Davis best played was herself, and it was the one everyone could identify with. She simply acted as if she were an irresistible force, and she got away with it. The New York Times. With no further film offers, to fill the void and to keep her legend alive, the indestructible Bette would borrow another page from Joan Crawford's Star Survival Manual. She would use herself to sell and sustain interest in her image and incredible career. At 80 and out of work, it was important to be seen. When her co-star Ann Sothern was nominated for an Academy Award for The Whales of August, which Davis had refused to promote, she nonetheless called Sothern and said she would accept for her if the actress was unable to attend the ceremonies. She also called Johnny Carson and other late-night TV hosts, asking when they intended to give themselves the substantial pleasure of having her on their talk shows as a guest. The blunt tactics worked. Offers came in, and it was decided that now was the time to give the world a brand new Bette. Previously conservative and modest in apparel, she met with a good friend of Catherine Cermak, Patrick Kelly, a whimsical, cutting-edge designer from Mississippi, now based in Paris. Grace Jones and Madonna wore his clothes, so he knew a few things about strong, independent women. When he met the prototype Bette, once he got over his initial shock and awe, he told her he was going to reinvent her sartorially from head to toe. With the figure and weight of a 12-year-old boy, she was to be his cartoon homage to what he thought an iconic Hollywood star should look like. And Bette, forgetting that she had frequently rapped Joan Crawford for her exuberant color-coordinated outfits and flashy ornamentation, went along with the zany metamorphosis. "I want to die with my high heels on, still in action," she said, appearing on TV in a form-fitting black dress with oversized rainbow buttons. Her custom-made red dress with black question marks splayed across the front was also a splendid distraction, as was the jewelry. Rings, bangles, brooches, large hoop earrings with assorted sorority pins stuck to her Archie Andrews beanie hat. Which is not to say that the new Bette Davis forgot how to look serious. For a literary event, she wore a chic black suit, red and black wide-brimmed hat, red and black reading glasses with gloves, handbag, and shoes to match. The best fun of all was getting styled for the numerous award shows that were being hustled up for her. In January 1989, she and Clint Eastwood were singled out for the American Cinema Awards in Los Angeles. Dressed in a white brocade gown with white fur cuffs, white fur pillbox, and ash blonde wig, Bette puffed and drank her way through the dinner, then passed out at her table. Carried supine by the staff, from the banquet room to the hotel manager's office, she was placed on a couch, where she remained for close to a half hour. Minutes before her award was announced, she re-entered the room fully refreshed and touched up. Escorted to the podium by Robert Wagner, she accepted the trophy, then proceeded to talk and sing at length, until Clint Eastwood gallantly cut in and helped her off the stage. That spring, following her 81st birthday, the really big tribute would come, from New York's prestigious Film Society of Lincoln Center. Previous honorees were Charlie Chaplin, Sir Laurence Olivier, Billy Wilder, and Alfred Hitchcock. When asked how she felt about adding this respected prize to her war chest, Bette said, "Greedy. Greedy. Can't have too many awards. I've gotten just about every award there is to get." Looking forward, never back, she said that Lincoln Center would be the best achievement, and until then she would be very nervous. And busy. Every step, on stage and off, had to be planned. She asked that a map be drawn and photos made of each entrance, exit, and in-between area at Alice Tully Hall, where the award ceremonies were to be held. She wrote the acceptance speech, adding, subtracting, and reinserting key lines from her movies. Timing the speech, she then performed it in full dress, standing in front of a full-length mirror in her living room. On the day before the event, wearing a David Kelly black wool dress and a vivid red wrap, Bette met with selected reporters in her suite at the Plaza Athénée in Manhattan. The following evening, after her blonde wig was brought back, reset, and restyled from the hairdressing salon, she proceeded to don her extremely tasteful tribute outfit. Black slip, black stockings, black jeweled embroidered gown, black shoes, one string of white pearls, and a brilliant diamond clip placed crown-like on the top of her little black mink hat. At 7:30 promptly, she emerged from the hotel, escorted by Harold Schiff, her lawyer. Waiting for them at Alice Tully Hall was the dutiful and vigilant Catherine Cermak. All was in order and ready. Escorted by 3 security guards, they made their way to the royal box. Upon entering, the star stood for a moment, waved to the applauding mob below, then sat down, and on cue, the lavish tribute began. Following the mandatory intro by the Society's chief, one by one the guest presenters appeared. Geraldine Fitzgerald, Anne Margaret, James Stewart, and All About Eve writer-director Joseph L. Mankiewicz, to talk of Bette and introduce clips from the momentous passages in her extraordinary motion picture career. All edited magnificently, with bracing economy and no overly intrusive on-screen competition from co-stars. Joan Crawford, thank you very much. "What a dump," said the honoree, standing on stage 95 minutes later. Thanking the presenters and the Film Society, she proceeded to toss aside any trace of humility by behaving as if this night was long overdue.
But she was grateful, and in closing, peering out into the audience of 2,700 people, the great actress paused, wide-eyed, then with each syllable dramatically measured, she cooed and gave them her saucy benediction. "I'd like to kiss you, but I just washed my hair." The standing ovation was timed at 1 minute and 47 seconds, all of which the teary-eyed old-timer embraced like a warm spring breeze. It was also tiring, and when she finally made it to the wings, she was told the decision was hers. If the long ceremony had exhausted her, she could skip the supper party at Tavern on the Green and return to the hotel in the wheelchair placed nearby. "We will go to the party," she said, "standing." As her limo arrived at the Central Park restaurant, I was walking toward the entrance. When I saw Catherine Cermak emerging from the limo, I stopped and watched as she walked over to the TV press assembled on our left. Addressing them, Cermak said, "Entertainment tonight? New York cable TV?" Each nodded. She returned to the limo, opened the back door, and extended her hand. As Bette Davis emerged, the TV camera lights were automatically switched on. Ignoring her companion's hand, the star, akin to Norma Desmond in Sunset Boulevard, weaved her way slowly toward the camera lights. Stopping before the reporters, she bade them to begin. Not wanting to miss a moment of this, I circled around, stood next to the ET cameraman, and listened. The questions were the usual, mostly mush. Until, believing that Bette Davis deserved more, I opened my mouth and heard myself saying, "Miss Davis, do you think Joan Crawford is up there tonight looking down at you and smiling?" "What?" said Davis. I repeated the question. With a mischievous, slightly askew grin, she looked straight at me, and as the TV cameras kept rolling, she said, "Well, I'm not sure Joan is up there. And if she is, she certainly is not smiling." Pure Betty. Fast, wicked, on target. Inside the restaurant, when I found my friends, many of them contemporary film critics, I sat and listened as they, rather blasé, summed up the evening as a swan song to the old Hollywood. Occasionally, they each surreptitiously glanced toward the far corner of the room, where the grand honoree was sitting, smoking and drinking and reveling in the attention she was receiving from the swell elegant parade of people that kept trooping toward her table. Later, when I perceived an extended gap in the line, I decided to pay my respects. I went over to Miss Davis, crouched by her chair, and said I wanted to apologize for asking that impertinent question outside about Joan Crawford. No, that was fine," said Betty, looking down at me with the largest blue eyes and the longest false eyelashes I had ever seen on anyone. Freed from the tease of the famous eyes, I reminded her that I was the author of the forthcoming book about her and Joan Crawford. "Oh," she said, no longer completely happy. "The book." "Yes," I said. "Does it have a title?" she asked. "Betty and Joan," I said. She mused on this. "In alphabetical order," I added, "like Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots." With her mouth curled toward me and the faint trace of a smile, she said, "Yes, I see." At the same time, a slight was emanating in her larynx, which, if released, I was sure, was going to explode into a laugh, or at least a wild cackle. But at that precise moment, her companion Catherine Cermak returned to the table, with 3 people in tow. I stood up. Betty looked at Cermak, then at me. "I will send you a copy when it's published," I said to her. "Yes, please do," she said, then turned to receive her new guests. 24. "I'm back, 100%. Now we must go out and find another script. There is one rolling around, but it's not at the point where we can say anything about it. Just yet. But I do love very much to work." Bette Davis, April 1989. Returning to California, she kept active, giving occasional interviews and posing for photographs. When it was remarked how thin she was, she said her health was fine, that her weight was perfect for future screen work.
In July, when it was reported that the magazine rights to the upcoming book, Bette and Joan, The Divine Feud, had been sold to 2 major publications, a week later, by an odd coincidence, the news came that Bette Davis was updating her 1962 memoir, The Lonely Life, to include her relationship with Joan Crawford. That Miss Davis had already written about this at length 2 years before, in the bestseller This and That, might have raised the question of redundancy. But who knows? Maybe our last conversation stirred dormant memories and new feelings about Miss Crawford. Also, in a way, I felt relieved. This would give Miss Davis the chance to respond to my book, due to be released in November. That she would not be overjoyed with some of the disclosures I also anticipated, sensing that Queen Bette would take to the airwaves and demand my head. Till then, I felt it was best to keep busy with a new, totally different work, a biography of Paddy Chayefsky, the most daring and prized screenwriter in Hollywood's history. He had written 3 Oscar-winning scripts, Marty, The Hospital, and Network. He also created the original TV play The Catered Affair, the film version of which starred Bette Davis, giving what she told me was her favorite and most under-acknowledged film performance. On Friday, October 6th, after spending the day at the Museum of Broadcasting in Manhattan, viewing kinescopes of Paddy Chayefsky's old TV plays, I was at home when a news flash came on TV. The legendary Bette Davis had died in France at the age of 81. Over the next few hours, more details came in. The cancer she had conquered so valiantly had returned. She received treatment for this in California, and the final prognosis was not good. But she insisted on traveling 6,000 miles to Spain to receive another award from the San Sebastian Film Festival. After the ceremonies, she became ill. Too weak to return to the U.S., she was flown to the American hospital outside Paris. At her side when she died was her faithful companion, Catherine Cermak. The following morning, as newspapers around the world featured her death on their front pages, television producers and reporters were scrambling to put their coverage together. At noon, I received a call from Cindy Adams, a New York columnist and co-host of A Current Affair on Fox TV. Another call was from a casting assistant for the Jonathan Ross program in London. Both asked if I would appear on their shows that Monday. The timing didn't seem right, I said. "But your book, Bette and Joan, was published here only last week," the Jonathan Ross assistant said excitedly. "And Bette Davis just died," said Cindy Adams. I mentioned something old-fashioned, like having respect for the dead, and wanting to wait until after Miss Davis was buried before flogging the book on TV or anywhere else. Meg Blackstone, my New York editor, understood this, as did the publicist for the book, due in stores in the U.S. on November 15th. Any and all interviews for radio, TV, and newspapers would be timed for that date, it was agreed. Wrong move publicity-wise, we soon learned, because it appeared that the wicked side of Bette Davis's turbulent spirit was still hovering. On the afternoon of October 31st, a purge swept through the halls of my respected, long-time New York publishing house, E.P. Dutton. It was described within the industry as the Halloween bloodbath. The executive publisher, editor-in-chief, and numerous staffers, including my editor and most of the publicity department, had been fired. The fate of Bette and Joan, The Divine Feud, set for release 2 weeks hence, was now in limbo. But then a funny thing happened on the way home from the funeral services. In mid-November, the reviews for the book began to appear. Included were positive assessments from serious but humorous critics, such as Luc Sante and Ireland's prime satirical playwright Hugh Leonard. Other sprightly coverage trickled in from leading columnists and reviewers in Great Britain and the U.S., followed eventually by the most important axle, the spinning, gleaming, word-of-mouth approbation from readers, including the fans of both stars, who in the holiday spirit gave copies or suggested to their friends they buy, borrow, or steal one. That December, among the holiday cards, was one from Bette Davis's daughter, B.D. Hyman. Sporting the direct frankness and humor of her mother, she wrote, "I hear Bette and Joan is terrific. I wish you the best. So, where's my copy?" In a droll afterthought referring to her recent loss, the death of her mother, she added, "Your timing turned out to be superb, did it not? A nice bonus. Love, B.D. and Jeremy."
I do not regret one professional enemy I have made. Any actor who doesn't dare to make an enemy should get out of the business.
Bette Davis, The Lonely Life, 1990. With her demise and the many tales of the protracted strife between her and Joan Crawford disclosed in the book I wrote, other stellar figures began to step forward to tell of their encounters with the formidable pair. In Second Act, Volume 2 of her memoirs, actress Joan Collins, named after her mom's favorite film star, Joan Crawford, met the legend in London during the late 1950s. It was at a party, and Crawford, with eyebrows as thick and dark as Groucho's, was disdainful and dismissive of the younger, sultrier English beauty. Not long after, Collins was in Hollywood working with Bette Davis on the set of The Virgin Queen. This was the starlet's first film for 20th Century Fox. Davis played the Queen, and Collins was Beth Throgmorton, her lady-in-waiting. On this particular day, Betty was ratty with everybody, snapping at the other court handmaidens for chewing gum. When her scene was ready to roll, Collins was to kneel at the Queen's feet and tie the satin bows on one of her shoes. Understandably nervous, Collins began to tremble and fidget, wherein Betty raised her foot and kicked her viciously, sending the young ingenue flying across the set, petticoats over my head, much to the amusement of the crew. Bette Davis didn't actually do that, it could be argued. It was the royal character, displeased with the inefficiency of her servant, who leveled that punt. The same polemic could be applied to the incident when she kicked Joan Crawford in the head during the filming of Whatever Happened to Baby Jane. For actors, serious actors become so immersed in the roles they play, they often get carried away by the unquenchable transferal of emotions. And true monarchs have standards, which when not met require prompt, dutiful repair or adjustment. Pax Deorum. She is taller than me, then she is too high, for I myself are neither too high nor too low. Elizabeth I on Mary, Queen of Scots. In the decades following their deaths, the legends of Betty and Joan continued to flourish, helped considerably by the release of their classic films on home video, followed by the equally lucrative output of the same on DVDs. The latter featured newly restored prints of their films, all dolled up in lavishly illustrated boxes with extras featuring film historians and other assorted guests commenting authoritatively on the private and professional lives of the two stars. With the digital revolution, tributes of a more emotional and often wry nature began to appear on the internet, via websites, blogs, and homemade videos. Regarding custom internet sites befitting the imperial countenance of Miss Davis, her official site concentrated solely on business, including the marketing of her illustrious name for hard cash up front. Miss Crawford, however, outdrew her with the sheer number of websites and fan pages glorifying her career and aesthetic appeal. The latter confirms what a hot number this luminous star really was, especially during the late 1930s and early 1940s, when Bette Davis and other prominent ladies in Los Angeles feared for the virtues of their husbands and young men when Joan was on the prowl in their neighborhood. As the ease and speed of computers grew, heated forums on Betty and Joan increased, questioning and debating who was the bigger star and better actress. New York writer Liz Smith, who knew both, stated in her column that Crawford was very much underrated, primarily because of her legendary glamour. And Betty? I believe she overrated herself in terms of what she was capable of as an actress. But that was part of her greatness, Smith added. She had an epic, staggering tunnel vision concerning Bette Davis and her own work. From time to time, their epic, enduring enmity for each other was also questioned in published hypotheses, some gushingly vague, others feverishly far out. One ardent hagiographer implied in her personal biographies that each actress had apparently read so much about their feud they started to believe it. Hard to swallow, since the major studios during the 1930s and 1940s had enormous power over the entertainment press. This included the hugely popular movie magazines, whose columnists were strongly encouraged to write chirpy, uplifting, and patriotic text about the gods and goddesses of Hollywood. Hence, Betty and Joan were seldom given the chance or the joy to read about the inside spats and sophisticated power plays both excelled in. Sexual trespassing sparked the feud, another biographer stated, deliberating that the discord between the two female stars began in 1934, when the relatively young Bette Davis was seen in her dressing room giving Franchot Tone a blowjob. Tone was engaged to Crawford at the time, but apparently that was okay. The BJ, that is, because Joan was really bisexual and always wanted a piece of Bette, said the biographer. But Bette wanted no part of a lesbian affair, and so the Homeric feud began. Salty stuff for sure. Except if Crawford ever made a sexual pass at Davis, then or later, the latter, unfailingly frank and forthright in her interviews and memoirs, would have mentioned this. Akin to the real-life Elizabeth I and Mary Queen of Scots, who never actually met, the legend of Bette and Joan, Hollywood's consummate film actress versus its ultimate movie star, will undoubtedly continue with fresh conjecture and new revelations, all beyond control or full comprehension. Which brings us to the subtitle of this book, The Divine Feud. Divine, as in otherworldly, not easily understood or agreed upon. The same applied to their personal lives and to the relentless professional drive both actresses were equipped with. Recently, when asked what other qualities the two contrasting legends shared, I pondered, then replied, spirit, talent, strength, discipline, perfectionism, vanity, territorialism, and stubbornness. For this update, I would like to add, God bless them both. And wherever they are, settle down, ladies, and try to make peace. Otherwise, as columnist Liz Smith commented, it's going to be a bumpy eternity.